Fight back!
You know, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, you know, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, you know, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com. And you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. We're reading today from Warrior Is by Harley and Robin Zephyr. It's the story of their great-grandfather who, in real life, killed Custer at Little Bighorn. And in fact, there's a map of the war, as it were, the battle. And they say that he is now the spirit keeper of Custer, which is remarkable. And there's a page-and-a-half introduction to the book, and then it becomes, a historically accurate novel, basically. This story is the traditional and cultural account of the life of Nikogju Lakota warrior Mato Nyanpi, saved by Bear, which his name in English, also later known as Scarleg. Warrior is based upon a true story. What you are about to read has been told to us through our family, passed down as oral history from generation to generation. Every family has its own story. This is ours. It's up to you to visualize and experience the events described herein in order to determine what you believe or what you choose to accept from what you learn from these pages. You've likely never read a story quite like this before. In Warrior Is, the reader is able to visualize and experience the events and circumstances of Mato Nyanpi's life. Many times the story is told in the present tense, such as if you were walking with Saved by Bear and his people as the events unfold. This was our original manner of storytelling. Other times the story is narrated in the past tense to account for a past perspective. Those of us who may not be entirely fluent in particular words or specific language, as much as we may be fluent in spirit and honest communication, the life messages many times can be more meaningful than just the written or spoken words. Warrior Is follows the timeline from the time of creation, moving through Saved by Bear's birth in 1849 and going up to July 1876, 2 weeks after the Grass Battle. Please exercise your free will and follow your conscience when reading this story. The spiritual side is called upon you to open your spirit so that you may read this tale and learn about these events through your own spirit. And, continues sort of like in that line, but here, right to the book. Prologue. He smelled the yellow of the sun. His spirit was alive and energetic. He felt the energy in his chest and all along the blood running through his veins. He looked to his left to see his great friend by his side. The strong scent of sage caressed his nostrils and reminded him of home. The movement over the high-running hilly ridge to the south caught his eye. He and Swift Bear sensed and felt the pathway opening up. So much had occurred so quickly, so suddenly, so dramatically. Their call to duty, his call to duty, filled his mind, his heart, his spirit. Today, it was meant to happen. It was presented to the people from the Creator. The plan was made. The warriors summoned. The preparation was done. It all led to this place, this portal in time. The sparse clouds to the west resembled mare's tails, and for a brief moment he remembered his white stone friend in the White Mountains. He remembered his spiritual commitment to protect his people, Grandmother Earth, and the sacred Hisapa. And time stood still for a moment, a small moment in time, through all of the ancient and original history of all the moments of time. And as the group of the horse-mounted soldiers rode briskly over the far ridge, the Creator shined that warm, nurturing light upon these warriors, such as Creator had been doing since the beginning of time, since the beginning of Grandmother Earth and Grandfather Sky, and at the beginning of all things. All the moments of time forever had arrived here, now. It had come to this. Creator's strong will and great invisible hand had placed them here. It was the Creator all along. It always was. It always would be. For one to know what led the young Lakota warriors to be here at this fateful site near the Greasy Grass River on this warm, sun-drenched day, one must go back in time, way back to the beginning, when it was only the Creator, and the Creator of all things decided to create a new world. Her name would be Unsimaka, Grandmother Earth, and she would be created to hold and sustain life. All kinds of beings, all kinds of people would be given and placed upon and within her to show her love of life. And this is how it all began. Chapter 1, Origin. The human beings evolved from the spirit. Before arriving in Wind Cave, we were star people. Many of us came from a place called the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, an ancient star grouping and constellation that contains worlds comprised of the gift of life-giving water. Water is life. Mini Wikoni. The Pleiadian influence is an absolute, but those of us who claim to be relatives of the Pleiadians share a common bond with other indigenous people, regardless of where we are geographically on the earth. We will always remain Pleiadian star people. Spiritually, we have become human beings of different races and ethnicities, but the origin of our spirit is the water. And for us, and as to who we are, as the tribal people in a family way, our name is Minkoju, its evidence. It means life's subsistence through the gathering and planting by the waters and or river. The Minikoju spend their lives living by the waters. This is something that many of our own people do not know or understand, but this is our history, not only of our physical existence, but also the history of our spiritual existence on Unsimaka. The book is Warrior Is by Robin and Harley Zephyr.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Take a breath. Breathing is an unusual bodily function in that it is both voluntary and involuntary. Compare digestion and blood flow. Those occur almost entirely without conscious influence, except for perhaps by the yogi. Breathing happens subconsciously too, thank you very much, but can also be controlled. In the 1970s, Dr. Herbert Benson wrote the book, The Relaxation Response. He taught full oxygen exchange, where more oxygen enters the body and more carbon dioxide exits. Controlled breathing, including 3 parts: inhaling deeply through the nose for a count of 5 or so, making sure that the abdomen expands, holding the breath for a moment, and then exhaling completely. Controlled breathing triggers the parasympathetic nervous response. It counters our sympathetic nervous system's fight or flight response to daily stresses. In effect, the relaxation response, the controlled breathing, is the anti-fight, anti-flight response. I came to grips with this later in life than I wish I had. The current president of the United States likes to get the heart up. He likes to trigger. He likes to trigger the fight or flight response, such as the ambit of a troll. And when he says preposterous things, when he says outrageous things, when he picks something that outrages us, when he picks an outrageous fight, it is not merely out of nowhere. And when you read or hear third hand of his racist rant, pause. Take a deep breath. Count to 5. Scan the room and see what else is going on. And with this occupant of the White House, there is always something else going on. There's a bully atop the bully pulpit. In the era of handheld media, the strength of the bully is to grapple attention. Not only with what the bully says, but with the outcries of the villagers in response when they have heard his horrible statements and when they respond. This gives the bully the chance to pick the fight. In the information age, the bully pulpit strikes the discordant chorus. And above that cacophony, the truth and the relevance can be hard to make out. The president triggered a national outrage boomlet over his attacks on Elijah Cummings in Baltimore. Mick Mulvaney, as chief of staff, said that if Mulvaney's former congressional district had as much poverty as Cummings' Baltimore district, Mulvaney would have been fired. Turns out Mulvaney's district was poorer. That got him a job in the Trump administration. But none of this was about Mulvaney's district. It also wasn't about Cummings' district. And attacks on Al Sharpton this morning aren't really also just about Al Sharpton. Trump was tweeting nasty. What do? We take a breath. We count to 5. It's actually kind of a long time. 2, 3, 4, 5. We scan the room and we see what else is going on. The House Oversight and Reform Committee voted on Thursday to authorize subpoenas for senior White House officials' communications via private email accounts and messaging applications. That includes Ivanka Trump. That includes Jared Kushner. And yes, you are listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. I am Jefferson Smith, sitting in and honored to be here. Thursday's vote by the panel came after the White House refused to turn over the messages voluntarily earlier this month, including senior advisor Jared Kushner's WhatsApp communications with foreign officials, and senior advisor Ivanka Trump's use of a private email account to conduct official business, and former chief strategist Steve Bannon's use of a personal mobile device for White House business. The committee, on Thursday, authored Cummings to subpoena all communications sent or received since President Donald Trump took office that were not already forwarded to official email accounts within 20 days as required by law. Cummings can also subpoena information about whether those messages contained classified information. Well, take a breath about that, Mr. President. Count to 5. And for the president, let us consider the poetry of learning more of the truth thanks to unsanctioned electronic messages on unsanctioned private servers. Take a breath, scan the room, and see what else is going on. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. It is Thom Hartmann Show. Honored to be with you this morning. Big show today. We'll have a chance to talk to Tim Wise. Tim Wise, who had a brilliant thread about comparing the defeat of David Duke with his recommended strategy for defeating Donald Trump in 2020. I have a couple questions I really wanted to ask him as soon as I read his thread. And thankfully, I have a chance to do it. I think you'll find it interesting. I think we'll all find it instructive. Also, we'll be talking to Alex Zaitchik of The New Republic. Who's Josh Hawley? It's worth knowing, not just because it's worth knowing who he is, but understanding what it suggests for the future of the party that is right now running the Supreme Court and running the presidency and running the U.S. Senate and running most state legislatures, but not running a majority of voters. In fact, not running a plurality of voters, coming in a relatively decisive second. We're also going to talk about the strategic map. I had a chance to listen to Eric Holder this morning in his work on redistricting and thinking about, as folks who know the times I sit in, I hope it is not merely my hobby horse to speak of democracy. Democracy is the raison d'etre, it is the first principle. It is also, to me, the most smart, maybe the smartest strategy. And we're going to talk about the strategic map. If you're in a blue city, what are smart ways to spend your political energy? If you're in a blue state, what are the smart ways to spend your political energy? What about if you're in a purple state? What if you're, I don't know, we're kind of, what should I focus on? If I'm not supposed to just focus on the presidency. What if I live in a red state, Jeff? We'll talk about that too. Or in a purple city. And I've got at least one strategy, some I got a couple, of where if I were going to invest human resource, maybe financial resource, political energy, political resource, in each of those different kinds of political contexts, what I think would be the smartest way to spend, or one of the smartest ways to spend some political energy. We'll also talk about Watch Your Language. The call-in number is 202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. We had calls for not merely using the word conservative because it no longer feels apt. Welcome opinions on what word that isn't merely inflammatory might be more apt, so we can pick from them. That and more today. Happy Monday, everybody. It's a big show. We have a lot to get through. With your help, we'll do it again. The call-in number is 202-808-9925. I'm Jeff Smith. Happy to be here.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jeff Smith, 202-808-9925. Howdy, everybody. I want to start by saying thank you for this isn't a commercial, but it's going to sound a little bit like one. Thank you for your support of Free Speech TV, and thank you for your support of purpose-driven media around the country. There is this debate this morning. The current president of the United States, Donald Trump, I assume you've heard his name before. He continued his screed on high-profile leaders of color in the United States. It started with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It started with Ilhan Omar, and then saying they should go back. Of course, they were U.S. citizens. Representative Presley has all of her ancestors also as United States citizens. He then switched his attention to Elijah Cummings, pivoting attention away from Cummings' committee subpoenaing the unsanctioned electronic communications from Trump senior officials, including Ivanka Trump. And then this morning, he went after Al Sharpton. And I say, well, our move needs to be take a breath, scan the room, see what else is going on. And I think the next move is, and the reason he's got us locked up, is when there's a racist thing, we've got to call it out. We've got to call it out. We're going to talk to Tim Wise later about why it is so important to do that, lest we, with our silence, permit it. So we've got to call it out. But what makes it possible, in fact, often what triggers it, what my wife likes to say is, I don't have to watch Fox News because I know what was on Fox News based on what Donald Trump tweets. If I know that Fox News covered Elijah Cummings' district because right after that, Donald Trump tweeted about it. And it's one of the reasons I say, while there needs to be focus on the president, there can't be merely focus on the president, that he is not the head of the snake. He is the tail. He is the rattler. And therefore, if there is going to be change at the top, there has to be change in the context. So much of our political power apparatus built in a time when Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House, when Democrats had double-barreled control of the U.S. Congress, had most state legislative seats, and there was this idea, well, pretty much if you could convince Tip, if you could convince a majority of Democrats, you got a chance of passing law in the United States. And that was the context that built so much of our political culture. That political culture is now decidedly different. We now have to lobby the context, and part of that context is, of course, the media landscape. And that's why y'all are so important. That's why I say the priceless thing. And that's why I want to say thank you to Free Speech TV. I also want to say thank you to Thom. He and his crew, he and Louise and the crew, are on the Hartmann cruise right now. And thank you to the people. I don't know if they have access to the radio. I've never been on a cruise. I don't know how they have on cruises. I know they have food and such. But thank you to the people who support the show and who have joined Thom and Louise on that cruise. That's why I'm here. That's why he is away. And he asked me to say hello and pass along that information. We'll be back with your phone calls. It's 202-808-9925. And a little bit later, we're going to be talking to Alec Zaitchik, I think I'm pronouncing that right, of The New Republic, and author of The Gilded Age, A Wild Ride Through Trump's America. What I'm going to ask him about is Josh Hawley, and why I think that's so interesting. We'll be back in just a moment. Howdy, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith, coming to you from sunny United States of America. I had back in the day when I was registering, turning out voters, I had a phone bank I wanted to do, and I just wanted a bunch of people to call people. You know, as you call people, tell them to vote. And I wanted them to say, you know, pick your own name. Your name could be John. Your name could be Phil. Your name could be Sue or Clarice, and you could say, "This is Sue from the United States of America, and I'm asking you to vote." And, you know, we're all from the United States of America. Let us go to John, also from the United States of America, more specifically San Francisco. John, how you doing?
Yeah, hi, good. How are you, Jefferson?
Holding up.
I just had a couple of suggestions about Twitter. I live about 10 minutes from Twitter building headquarters, and I've never gotten their account. I'm not a big fan of Jackie Dorsey. And anyway, or Twitter's business model. But I don't read those Twitters, and when I see Trump on the television, I mute him and switch the channel. And I had a suggestion. Thom last week said something about this, I think, and I don't know if you talked about it also, but when you're skipping around on the tube and you switch from one channel to the other, this is the way it was a little while ago, I don't know if it's changed, but if you pause for more than 15 seconds on one channel, that counts, that's registered in some, collection data thing. Yeah. But just keep switching, it doesn't really go on. And one thing that I noticed when Trump was trying to undermine the Democrats in January when they had their response to the White House State of the Union,
yep,
was that a lot of people boycotted that speech and then turned on the Democratic speech. Do you remember that one?
Yep.
Yeah, and that worked. He got that. He was really pissed about that. And if we ignore him and turn him off and shut him off and stop responding to him directly as much, I think it'll take some air out of his tires. What do you think?
I think what you said is really important. I appreciate the call, John. That we live in an attention social media economy. We live in an attention economy. What we give attention to has currency. And Donald Trump has hacked the attention currency. I don't have a final view. In fact, I have a debate going with a few different people about the best way to deal with this. And one of the reasons I raise topics is not because I've figured everything out, but because it's helpful to me to process this stuff with the smart people who participate in the Thom Hartmann community. And it helps me think about stuff. As the writer once said, I write to figure out what I think about things. And for me, I'm a verbal processor in significant part, and it's helpful to me to talk about this stuff to connect my synapses and figure it out. I do think we have to be more intentional with our attention. We have to be more intentional with our attention. And the way those algorithms work is if you stop, and it's true, it's similar. I mean, I don't know if 15 seconds, it's different than Nielsen ratings, it's different than TV. But we had a social media training in our shop just the other day, and it was actually on Instagram. And the teaching was what you have to do is design your post to make people stop. Because, you scroll through, you flip through, you swipe up. And the best posts, and by best, I mean the ones that have currency. The ones that have currency are the ones that garner attention. And the ones that garner attention are the ones that make you stop. And Donald Trump's tweets make us stop. Now, the reason why it's a debate, and one of the reasons why we're going to talk to Tim Wise later on, is because he knows that if he says the right triggering thing, people of goodwill have to respond. And then MSNBC has to go to Al Sharpton and get a comment from Al Sharpton, and all of a sudden it gets to be the lead story instead of something else being the lead story. I think that the answer is to give less attention, absolutely, and then also try to pivot to something that is nonetheless a moral imperative. So he doesn't always get to pick the fight. I'll have more thoughts about that, but I want to get to Ben from Reseda, California. Reseda, California, as I recall, the home of the Karate Kid. Go ahead.
Thank you. One of the things that I want to say is that we should label Donald Trump based on an historical, philosophical concept coming from the Italian Middle Ages, if you will, by a person by the name of Machiavelli. Machiavelli wrote many books and treatises on how to politically disrupt any kind of situation. And if we put a label on Trump, and instead of calling him Trump, we add Machiavelli and educate people as to what Machiavelli taught, then people will realize that everything that he does is Machiavellic. And I think that if that label can stick and people educate themselves as to what Machiavelli wrote and how Trump operates, there is a very strong parallel in Machiavelli's teaching and writing.
And Ben, we only have about 40. Ben, we only have about 40 seconds left. Appreciate the Machiavelli reference. And if you were going to name one thing that you think it might make right, if there was one principle that we have sort of gleaned from Machiavelli that we should be attaching to Trump, what would that principle be?
Disruption.
Ben, thank you so much for the call. My dad, for what it's worth, has made the same point, and I also appreciate it. I think it's also linked to the previous caller that we can use the moments of potential outrage and anger, and instead of merely accessing our reptilian brain, if we can try to access our frontal lobes and use them as teaching moments. I think that is helpful. In fact, the other Italian leader, this time not only a political advisor, but a ruler, Pop suggested to me that who Trump reminded him of, with his bearing, with the fact that he never smiled, with his choice of words, with Benito Mussolini. And I hope in this show we have a chance to be a little smarter, rather than just letting ourselves get a lot dumber. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. It's 202-808-9925.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jeff.
Our book for today on the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Kingdom of Lies, Unnerving Adventures in the World of Cybercrime by Kate Fazzini. This is from the preface. It didn't take me long in my career as a cybersecurity executive to figure out everyone was lying to me. The biggest lie of all came at the very beginning, that cybersecurity is hard, too hard, certainly too difficult for someone who lacks years and years of deep technical training. That is no place for writers. That thicket of incomprehensible jargon alone seemed meant to discourage outsiders like me from entering the field. They told me I could never hope to understand the terminology unless I'd worked around it for a very long time, unless I had a special and complicated certification, unless I knew how to take apart and reassemble a computer, unless I knew how to code in Python and could read it, interpret it, and spot problems on sight. And if I somehow managed to learn the lingo, the learning curve for the rest of it would prove insurmountable. Lies, lies, lies. It's unfortunate because there's a huge gap between the demand for cybersecurity workers and the people available to fill those jobs. I think one of the reasons for that is because people can't imagine themselves doing this kind of work. Can you use a smartphone, make a PowerPoint, think on your feet, ever organize a night out to the movies with your friends that went well and nobody crashed their car to or from the event? Welcome to the 21st century's hottest career path. Are you able to charm the pants off women? Did you escape an abusive marriage? Have you ever hosted a toddler's birthday party at your home? Honey, I want you on my cybersecurity team. After reading the stories in this book, you will understand that what makes cybersecurity complicated is the complexity of human beings. So if you know how to deal with people, you can handle internet security. If you understand what makes people tick, not only will you be able to recognize a threat, you'll be one step ahead of your adversary. During my career as a cybersecurity executive at multinational corporations, a journalist for Wall Street Journal and later CNBC, and a professor at Georgetown University, I've met a lot of fascinating people. From the hackers who perpetrate malicious attacks to the security professionals who try to prevent these incidents from happening, and the alphabet soup of government agencies that do damage control. At the end of the day, they're all fathers, sons, mothers, sisters, and spouses. In other words, people just like us. Yes, the white hats cross paths with black hats and change alliances more frequently than you might expect, but they're driven by the same desires as the rest of us, even if sometimes it feels as if everyone in cybersecurity is allergic to the truth. As a professional, I was told a great many lies about the field I have grown to love so much. After becoming a journalist on the cybersecurity beat, I was told even more. Here are a few. Let me introduce you to the hacker community. This lie is usually delivered with a wink and a nod from someone who thinks they know every hacker on the planet. The truth of the matter is there is no hacker community. Sure, the guys who make a splash at the big annual conferences might say otherwise, but every country, every state, every faction, every identifying group has its own community of people who hack computers. Some of them are extremely conservative. Others are massively liberal. Some fall in between. Some wear suits and ties and work as lawyers during the day, while others look like everyday citizens and have great people skills as they pursue the idiosyncratic agendas. Some are good guys who got fed up with the low pay and boring duties and became criminals. Some are criminals who ended up being good guys. Many start and end their careers on either end of that spectrum. Some, including many you'll meet in this book, are extremely proficient hackers who have no time or inclination to identify with any community at all. As a journalist, I was astonished at the number of people who came out of the woodwork to offer me exclusive access to the hacker community. I couldn't help but notice that the members of the source's hacker community were often people just like him or her. My point is there are many different types of people working in this field, and I can guarantee you that a lot of them are exactly like you. Here's another lie. He's a luminary in the cybersecurity field. He's probably not. Fame and luminescence don't typically intersect in this field. The people I've met who are actual geniuses aren't famous, and most of them don't have social media profiles. They tend not to pontificate on areas outside their expertise. The people who are constantly headlining conferences and who are so often offered up to me for interviews have less insight than those who stay underground. Anything a high-profile hacker is willing to share typically carries with it a massive and crystal clear agenda that I've learned to spot from a mile away. Even if a conversation is off the record, the intel coming from a top government official or other marquee corporate cybersecurity name carries little novel information. The only people who have illuminated the way for me in this world, and in this book, have been genuine practitioners who never held a C-level title. You've never heard of them, and because I've changed their names to protect their privacy, you probably never will. They are luminaries not because of the degrees they've collected or the events they've headlined, but because they carry a lantern that guides the path for others. These types of people typically don't have a public relations team. One of my favorite lies, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This one is usually delivered by someone who asserts that he or she knows the cybersecurity field better than anyone else. These people will brag that they know what it's like to be a hacker and can do things that no one else in the room can do. I'm always wary of those who try to establish their bona fides by discrediting the expertise of other cybersecurity professionals. The depth and breadth of this field is so vast that anyone who works in it is an expert at some part of it. And I have yet to meet someone who is an expert at all of it, not even close. Every view of an incident is informed by the reviewer, what he sees, what her level of expertise is, and that changes over time. It's like asking someone who lives in the Plaza to describe Manhattan. The book is Kingdom of Lies by Kate Fazzini.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Howdy, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. Want to say thanks for joining us. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. The phone's lit up. Lots of folks want to offer words for what we ought to call conservatives, Republicans, or more aptly call the team that is now behind this president, that is now propping up from 36 to 42% almost anything, including being in the middle of the street and shooting somebody in Manhattan, or just picking a different racist screed every few days in the hopes that all we'll talk about are those racist screeds. Right now, I want to talk to Alex Zaitchik, freelance journalist, contributor to The New Republic, author of The Gilded Age, A Wild Ride Through Donald Trump's America. Alex, hello there.
How you doing? Good to be here.
I am well. Who the heck? I am fascinated by, almost fascinated, certainly curious about Josh Hawley and why we think he matters, what he represents. Who the heck is Josh Hawley?
He is the junior senator from Missouri. He beat Claire McCaskill in the last election, and he's got a lot of attention during his brief stint on the national stage for his rather unconventional form of religious conservatism, which harkens back to things we haven't seen in a while. The closest echo is probably something like Pat Buchanan's 1992 presidential run. And it has been allied with a strain of intellectual conservatism that's come under the rubric of post-liberalism, which we can talk about, but basically is embraced by this group, which is sort of a revival of this Buchananite republicanism, which we haven't seen in a while.
So how does that manifest itself? How is that different from, let's say, what would be the shades that make him different from Mitch McConnell, and also then what shades might make him different from Donald Trump?
That's the big question. The main thing is a break with this Republican orthodoxy on the free market and this idea that the state has to be made as small as possible, should not have a strong hand in the economy or regulating social norms and mores. It's a very it's a strain of conservatism that embraces the idea of a strong government, of a very robust nationalism. A lot of this stuff people associate with Trump's rhetoric, if not his practice so far as president, but a lot of the rhetoric on his campaign trail sort of embodied this more sort of activist state conservatism, which, and again, this isn't just in the service of a sort of social justice program. It's actually more about a moral project of asserting the state's control over the morality of the society. So,
and where from a policy? Go ahead. Didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine.
Where, from a policy perspective, would he differentiate? So some of his language, I know some of his language, he'll go after big tech and say that maybe government has some role to make sure that big tech is not blank. Of course, his is not blank is not favoring big cities or is favoring white nationalists. Right? I mean, it doesn't. His willingness to hold grip on the market. I mean, heck. We have had totalitarian regimes that have been willing to hold grip on the market without advocating for real freedom or advocating for real equality. But from a policy perspective, what to you is most interesting about Hawley or most surprising?
Well, I think the first thing to note is his economic populism, as well as the economic populism of this larger group that he's associated with, is mostly rhetorical up to this point. Yeah. I mean, Hawley ran, when he was Attorney General, he was against raising the minimum wage in Missouri. He was against labor laws to protect unions. He's against the Affordable Care Act. I mean, things that bread and butter issues that help the great forgotten American middle working class person that he likes to talk about. In fact, he's against those policies. So in practice, there's not a whole lot to differentiate him from your sort of standard Koch-funded Republican, which he is. He's completely funded by Koch dark money in his elections so far. But rhetorically, he's hinting at some sort of new Trumpian formula that would, in theory, incorporate policies to help the middle of the country, these communities that he likes to talk about where people are forgotten and there's an opioid crisis and factories are shutting down. But we haven't really seen it yet in terms of policy. He has one drug pricing bill that would reduce the cost of prescription drugs a little bit, but that's really about the substance of it. So you have to wonder what's really going on here.
Well, I think we know. I think we know, and that it's the same game for a long time, right? They've got to have people whose basic argument is to disrupt democracy for the benefit of controlling more and more concentrated capital, have to have, in a way, where there are votes, they have to figure out how to win some votes. I mean, they can erode democracy, right? They can have unfettered money. They can draw districts. They can rely on non-majoritarian mechanisms. They can try to suppress votes. And in fact, that's pretty close to a playbook of the anti-democracy movement over the last 40 years, and particularly gaining steam over the last 15. But they also got to figure out some way to at least get some poor people to vote for them. And that move has been Christian conservatism, has been racism, has been white nationalism. And it's getting, I think, a little harder. One of the reasons I think it's interesting is it's getting a little harder now that wealth disparities are getting bigger. I mean, it's more, some of the same conditions that helped FDR become president of the United States are resembling, not in terms of the economic collapse, but in terms of the big wealth gaps. The things that built the progressive movement 100 years ago are starting to manifest themselves again. And of course, you can't actually vote for policies that would ramp up antitrust enforcement, that would rebuild the middle class, that would boost the minimum wage. You can't actually build a pro-middle class, pro-democracy agenda and win a Republican primary and get Republican campaign contributions and get Koch dollars. But you can talk about them, and even Tucker Carlson will find what you're saying interesting.
Yeah, I think that's about right. And what we do see in place of actual policy substance is a lot of familiar red meat about borders and the integrity of the nation, quote unquote. And this is a very sort of ethnically, racially coded definition of the nation that these guys are talking about. They just had a very high-profile conference in D.C. You may have discussed it on the show, in which they were sort of trying to figure out how to talk about this new neo-nationalism on the right in ways that weren't explicitly in racist terms, but they really couldn't do it. I mean, it was, they had control of their own conference, and even by their own terms, they couldn't keep it in bounds. So
I didn't talk about this conference. I didn't talk. What was it? Was this the National Conservatism Conference?
That's it, yeah. And it was sort of the coming out event of this group that's being called the post-liberals, which, again, is really just a revival of this Buchananite tradition on the right, which has always kind of been there, but it was suppressed for a long time by this Republican fusion coalition that had business and libertarians in charge of the party. business Republicans and libertarians. And these guys are trying to assert independence and eventually reassert control of the party. And they had this conference which they were trying to make the case for their version of nationalism, and they were trying to separate themselves from the ruder, cruder, more rougher-edged elements of the Trump presidency and his rhetoric, and they really couldn't do it. They had speakers talking about how this country would just be better off the whiter it is, how immigrants can't assimilate, even though they talk a lot about religion, and immigrants are some of the most pro-church, family-oriented people in the country, if you look at the numbers. So there's a lot of disconnect and a lot of contradiction in what they're trying to do and what they're saying. So one would be very advised to cast a very suspicious eye on any of their claims regarding either the economic populist side of it or this, we're not really racists, we're just interested in the American worker.
Do we have another
suspect?
Do we have another name? Already asked, put the call out to our listeners. We're blessed by having having a really smart set of listeners for alternative language from the word conservative, which I think has not applied to and does not accurately describe the apparatus that right now controls much of the American government. Do we have another word for populist?
That's a very long and fraught.
I know, but like racism ain't actually all that popular. Like a lot of us feel it, but when we think about it, we're not supposed to like it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're talking about the left tradition of populism, that's sort of the more authentic version. And then on the right, I think these guys, if you have to put a word on them, are really just demagogues. And they're kind of posing as a sort of reactionary populist, but really there's a much more insidious program here, which is allied with elites and hierarchies.
If what you do is race baiting or even religion baiting or even nationalism baiting in order to promote an agenda that benefits the narrow few of the nation, I think it's been an enormous mistake by the national conversation to allow that to be called populist rather than hucksterism or something else. Anyway, where can I find out more, good sir?
Where can you find out more?
Yeah.
I wrote an article for the New Republic about this subject last week called "Is Josh Hawley for Real?"
Is he for real?
No, he's not.
Appreciate your time.
In some ways he is, but not in the way that matters.
Got to read the article. We'll be back.
To Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with your calls, 202-808-9925. Lisa from Santa Rosa, California, you're on the air.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks for taking the call and all that stuff. Last week, you reminded us about, how much words matter. And you said something about, let's just call it the Trump report, the Trump investigation, what it really is. And I had a little epiphany because, when you are just smothered by all the other kind of crap on the, airwaves, it's sort of hard to remember. That's exactly correct. We should call it what it really is. For example, report and Trump investigation. Moscow Mitch may actually take hold, and if we can just keep saying Trump report, Trump investigation, just don't forget, say it on TV. You were right. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. I agree with you, and by that I mean I agree with myself. But
Exactly. And if you can find another word for populism, I would really be appreciative.
It'd be handy.
It drives me crazy.
No, like if you. So what we know, right? What Hannah Arendt taught us was that, and what studies of totalitarian regimes taught us was, what helped build the fascist movements in the middle of the last century, early portion of the last century, was when demagogues, when race baiters, you pick your name, when would-be fascists would would be anti-Semitic, when they would give their strong anti-Jewish diatribes, they'd get their loudest cheers. They'd get their biggest crowds.
Absolutely.
And that helped feed. I mean, there were other, like, Adolf Hitler was not the only anti-Semitic leader. He was not the only person running for office and trying to build a movement in post-Weimar Germany. There were others as well, but he was the one that could get the biggest crowds and get the biggest cheers. And that's one of the reasons I don't think that Donald Trump is unimportant when I say he's the rattler. I mean, he is not the master strategist of all things. But would we have called those various competing would-be fascists, would we have called them populists? Is that what we would have called them?
No, but they do now, and that drives me crazy. Thank you.
Crazy too. Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate it. We got time for another one. Let's go to Stephen from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I think it's pronounced Albuquerque. Stephen, you there?
Yeah, Albuquerque. Yeah.
Oh, Albuquerque. That's right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize to people how much power that 3-4 decades of AM hate radio has influenced this nation. I was raised in the Midwest, and a lot of my uncles and cousins owned family farms. And they were raised God-fearing people, conservative, some Republican, some Democrat. But as the years went on, and these AM radio stations got more and more people like Rush Limbaugh preaching the gospel that if your life sucks, it's because of the Democrats, the liberals. It's because of what they're doing to your country. And this diatribe's gone on for decades. And I'm thinking now here in the year 2019, a lot of them no longer farm and have sold off the land and rented it and so forth. And I'm thinking none of my relatives would have voted for a city slicker like Donald Trump, who uses lawyers to get out of trouble all the time and never pays his workers that he hires. This is a man I could not believe could ever be accepted by my family.
Or people in Methodist and Baptist churches voting for him and deciding that somehow his conduct is Christian. I want to respond to that right after this. This is Tom's show. I'm Jeff. In the break, Stephen made a really important point about the rise of right-wing radio and the impact that had on the electorate in the United States. They had all sorts of relatives who, had been of mixed political background, that all of a sudden were convinced that the way to salvation was to be a monochromatic political voting bloc, and then eventually twist themselves into thinking that, to use his word, a city slicker who relied on lawsuits to avoid responsibility would be supported by those rural voters, and that his conduct would be deemed acceptable by Christians. And that was all made possible, so said our smart caller, by the rise of right-wing radio. And my answer is not only yes, but heck yes. Not only yes, but heck yes. And, Tom, Tom is Thom Hartmann. This is his show. I'm Jeff Smith. I'm sitting in. He's on a cruise, not because he's taking a break, because he's doing it with Hartmann listeners and loyal supporters of the show. And so I have the honor of sitting in. And when Tom is here, he often talks about the fairness doctrine. And I'm like, it seems sort of old news. I mean, the fairness doctrine, that was a long time ago. Why do we need to talk about the fairness doctrine? Is it really, with the fairness doctrine, you couldn't then have a channel that was all liberal talkers, all progressive talkers, all Democratic talkers. You pick your word. Those are each different words, meaning slightly different things. And why did he talk about it? Well, that made it possible. Eliminating the fairness doctrine, saying that you could have an FCC broadcasting license and you did not need to offer equivalent airtime to people of different viewpoint on a particular political issue. The elimination of that made it possible so that the people with large concentrations of wealth could be monochromatic and monotheistic and monopolitical party in their media offerings. And that allowed for Rush Limbaugh to have not only just the Rush Limbaugh show surrounded by other stuff, but Rush Limbaugh show surrounded by ditto heads, surrounded by other folks that sounded pretty much like him, maybe not as skillful. And to tease that out a little bit, to understand how important that is, and why, frankly, why I've been spending time in my hometown trying to work on radio, not just because I'm fighting the last war, maybe a little bit, but also because I know that led to Fox News. A guy named Barry Diller, right, who helped come up with 21 Jump Street, pitched to Rupert Murdoch the idea for Fox News. And when he pitches, look what's happened in radio. Look, if you get sort of emotionally, culturally conservative white people and older people and rural people, that is actually a pretty darn big market in the United States of America. You don't have to mess with sort of multiculturalism. You don't have to mess with people of other faiths and other and other races. And if you just set aside other political viewpoints, there's a market here. You get 30+% of the country. If you can get 30% plus of the country to watch anything, it's enormous. 30% of the country didn't go see Avengers Endgame, and they built Fox News on the back of right-wing radio. And now, when Donald Trump says something ridiculous and outrageous and infuriating and racist, he does it knowing that he has the backing of the largest propaganda arm in the history of this country. And he can get away with it. And that's why I say we can't only focus on the president. We also have to focus on the apparatus. There's someone who disagrees with me. Let's take their call. Johnny from Lamarck, Texas. Trump, you say, is not the rattler. Go ahead, speak your piece.
Yeah, I would say that Trump is the one of a two-headed snake, which is the result of environmental degradation and pollution. And the rattler doesn't even enter into the picture because of the actual biting that he and the GOP have done, not just in the past 2 years, but in the past 30 years. He is busily, literally taking apart this government, the environment, our education system, all our protections for worker safety, consumer market safety, marketplace safety, rights for the workers, anything and everything that's not nailed down, this guy is undoing. So he's not just a rattler. He is the actual guy with the fangs. And as for somebody characterizing him as a Machiavelli, no. Any Machiavellians that are in the administration are some of his advisors, like maybe Bannon. But Machiavelli would not have spoke and represented himself the way Trump has. The only reason why he's in power is because of the media. The media gave him that halo, and they ignored Bernie Sanders on purpose. The only true populist was Bernie, not Trump. Trump was a plagiarizer.
Johnny, thank you so much for the call, and I'll largely agree with you. And I'll say any analogy, any metaphor is wrong. In fact, it usually subscribed to Einstein, but it wasn't Einstein who said all theories are wrong, but some are useful, and so the analogies have limits. But understanding, I think where we agree is, or at least where I agree with you, is that we have to look beyond merely. You make the good point. We got to focus on the president. Yes, we got to also look beyond just the president, because even you made the point of the advisors. Matthew from Grand Rapids, I think that's in Michigan. Go ahead, Matthew.
It is second home of Gerald Ford, president of the United States, one of the arguably the most sane Republican presidents we've had in a long time. So he's still highly respected here. Hey, I got
nominated Justice John Paul Stevens. Go ahead.
Yeah, that too. And it's interesting. We just lost him, of course.
Yeah.
A fun story for you. I was interning for a senator here, a Democratic senator here in the would have been 1997-8. And I worked in the office answering phones. We got what would happen every afternoon, and I'm not making this up, between 3 and maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the phone would start ringing off the hook.
Wow.
With people saying, why are the Clintons doing this? Why is Hillary doing this? Why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? And we couldn't figure out, where is this coming from? We figured out Rush Limbaugh was on to 12 to 3. From 3 to 4, that phone would not stop ringing with whatever he said. It was literally regurgitated back to us.
So they would listen. They would listen. They wouldn't call during the show. They'd listen to the show, and right after the show, they'd light you up.
Yeah, between 3 and 4. And it took us months to figure out, why does this keep happening at this time, and why do they keep saying this? And finally, we asked one gentleman, he said, where are you getting this information? Well, I was just listening to the radio. Who are you listening to? Mr. Limbaugh. So the power of right-wing radio in the 90s was huge. We'd literally have 5, 10, 15 calls a day as soon as Limbaugh wrapped it up. So the power of AM radio, I'm just echoing what that other gentleman said, big impact, especially in the 1990s.
Matthew, thanks for sharing with us your testimony. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. We're going to be back after this break. We appreciate you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
You know, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, you know, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, you know, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com. And you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. Our book for today on the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Kingdom of Lies, Unnerving Adventures in the World of Cybercrime by Kate Fazzini. This is from the preface. It didn't take me long in my career as a cybersecurity executive to figure out everyone was lying to me. The biggest lie of all came at the very beginning, that cybersecurity is hard, too hard, certainly too difficult for someone who lacks years and years of deep technical training. That is no place for writers. That thicket of incomprehensible jargon alone seemed meant to discourage outsiders like me from entering the field. They told me I could never hope to understand the terminology unless I'd worked around it for a very long time, unless I had a special and complicated certification, unless I knew how to take apart and reassemble a computer, unless I knew how to code in Python and could read it, interpret it, and spot problems on sight. And if I somehow managed to learn the lingo, the learning curve for the rest of it would prove insurmountable. Lies, lies, lies. It's unfortunate because there's a huge gap between the demand for cybersecurity workers and the people available to fill those jobs. I think one of the reasons for that is because people can't imagine themselves doing this kind of work. Can you use a smartphone, make a PowerPoint, think on your feet, ever organize a night out to the movies with your friends that went well and nobody crashed their car to or from the event? Welcome to the 21st century's hottest career path. Are you able to charm the pants off women? Did you escape an abusive marriage? Have you ever hosted a toddler's birthday party at your home? Honey, I want you on my cybersecurity team. After reading the stories in this book, you will understand that what makes cybersecurity complicated is the complexity of human beings. So if you know how to deal with people, you can handle internet security. If you understand what makes people tick, not only will you be able to recognize a threat, you'll be one step ahead of your adversary. During my career as a cybersecurity executive at multinational corporations, a journalist for Wall Street Journal and later CNBC, and a professor at Georgetown University, I've met a lot of fascinating people. From the hackers who perpetrate malicious attacks to the security professionals who try to prevent these incidents from happening, and the alphabet soup of government agencies that do damage control. At the end of the day, they're all fathers, sons, mothers, sisters, and spouses. In other words, people just like us. Yes, the white hats cross paths with black hats and change alliances more frequently than you might expect, but they're driven by the same desires as the rest of us, even if sometimes it feels as if everyone in cybersecurity is allergic to the truth. As a professional, I was told a great many lies about the field I've grown to love so much. After becoming a journalist on the cybersecurity beat, I was told even more. Here are a few. Let me introduce you to the hacker community. This lie is usually delivered with a wink and a nod from someone who thinks they know every hacker on the planet. The truth of the matter is there is no hacker community. Sure, the guys who make a splash at the big annual conferences might say otherwise, but every country, every state, every faction, every identifying group has its own community of people who hack computers. Some of them are extremely conservative. Others are massively liberal. Some fall in between. Some wear suits and ties and work as lawyers during the day, while others look like everyday citizens and have great people skills as they pursue the idiosyncratic agendas. Some are good guys who got fed up with low pay and boring duties and became criminals. Some are criminals who ended up being good guys. Many start and end their careers on either end of that spectrum. Some, including many you'll meet in this book, are extremely proficient hackers who have no time or inclination to identify with any community at all. As a journalist, I was astonished at the number of people who came out of the woodwork to offer me exclusive access to the hacker community. I couldn't help but notice that the members of the source's hacker community were often people just like him or her. My point is there are many different types of people working in this field, and I can guarantee you that a lot of them are exactly like you. Here's another lie. He's a luminary in the cybersecurity field. He's probably not. Fame and luminescence don't typically intersect in this field. The people I've met who are actual geniuses aren't famous, and most of them don't have social media profiles. They tend not to pontificate on areas outside their expertise. The people who are constantly headlining conferences and who are so often offered up to me for interviews have less insight than those who stay underground. Anything a high-profile hacker is willing to share typically carries with it a massive and crystal clear agenda that I've learned to spot from a mile away. Even if a conversation is off the record, the intel coming from a top government official or other marquee corporate cybersecurity name carries little novel information. The only people who have illuminated the way for me in this world, and in this book, have been genuine practitioners who never held a C-level title. You've never heard of them, and because I've changed their names to protect their privacy, you probably never will. They are luminaries not because of the degrees they've collected or the events they've headlined, but because they carry a lantern that guides the path for others. These types of people typically don't have a public relations team. One of my favorite lies, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This one is usually delivered by someone who asserts that he or she knows the cybersecurity field better than anyone else. These people will brag that they know what it's like to be a hacker and can do things that no one else in the room can do. I'm always wary of those who try to establish their bona fides by discrediting the expertise of other cybersecurity professionals. The depth and breadth of this field is so vast that anyone who works in it is an expert at some part of it. And I have yet to meet someone who is an expert at all of it, not even close. Every view of an incident is informed by the reviewer, what he sees, what her level of expertise is, and that changes over time. It's like asking someone who lives in the Plaza to describe Manhattan. The book is Kingdom of Lies by Kate Fazzini.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Words matter. Today we'll do some Watch Your Language. I also promised we'd get to your phone calls. My name is Jefferson Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. And let's go straight to the person who is winning our Most Patient Listener Award. And that is Elon from Dallas, Ehan from Dallas, Texas. Go ahead, Ehan.
Eon.
Thanks for calling, Eon.
How you doing, Jeff?
Holding up.
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. I like to say that you have a lot of patience and that you handle these calls a lot better than Tom, if that means anything to you.
Well, I appreciate the compliment. I don't think we have to differentiate. But anyway, go on.
Okay, well, I was expecting for you to be a little less arrogant than Tom. Most of you people have this tone of arrogance when you're trying to do a public service, and I think you all are missing the whole picture here.
What's the picture we need to catch?
in order for you to elect a president, don't you think, or any politician, don't you think that they should have at least served some public service? Don't you think that should be a requirement? We need to stop with the lies. I mean, why is it that it takes the public and the poor to elect a president? Why is it that all these politicians are still collecting money to raise all this money? This is a game of raising money. This is not a democracy.
I heard you say two things. Go ahead.
The whole entire planet with this idea of democracy and freedom of speech, and now you have the alt-right, all the Nazis grabbing all the things that you are trying to infect the whole planet. The planet is infected with this idea from the 1900s of the monkey see, monkey do, and then it's a layer over layer on syndromes, and you guys are trying to make something out of your own problem. This is your curse. You're just awakening to your own curse. I don't understand it. You're fooling yourself. Do you have any children?
So before I respond to that, I want to make sure I respond. I've heard you made 2 points. One is there should be a requirement for public service prior to being president. A second thing I heard you say was that money was infecting the political process. When your voice got elevated, it was harder for me to take away from that the most cogent point you were trying to make. What do you see as the curse? Do you see it as money dominating everything, or are you identifying the curse as something else?
You see, I don't even know. Something's wrong with your line, or somebody is messing with your system. Because what I am hearing, I'm not communicating with you. This is a joke.
Which is the joke?
This right here, right now, what we're doing. You and I trying to communicate. We're not communicating. There is a delay. There is some sort of interference. We're not even This is like you trying to tell me that you went to the moon when everybody is here debating that you haven't gone to the moon because it's a lie between you and Russia. And Russia right now is your biggest ally, really. Russia and China shouldn't have anything to do with politics to begin with, because they are not supposed to be trading in the entire world. All of a sudden, they are the ones controlling the entire economy. What economy?
All right. Yeah, I apologize. I got to let you go. I did think you said a couple of things are pretty important. One was a sort of question, and the other was a point. The question I heard you say is, should there be a requirement for public service prior to running for president? I don't think that there ought to be I don't think there should be such a requirement. I think that except for the degree that it lives in the hearts and minds and opinions of American voters, I do think it should be one of the things very seriously taken into consideration when they vote. Second, are we in a real democracy, or are we in something that's being bought and paid for? As I say just about every time I'm here, to too great a degree, it's something bought and paid for. The other thing I want to respond to was not the line of your logic, which at times I must acknowledge was hard for me to follow, but the fact that you think it's all just absurd and that all of us should probably scream a little bit more and probably yell outside our windows that we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore because we try to have a serious conversation to make serious stuff that just feels absolutely absurd. And with that, sir, I agree with you. We are dealing with things that are absolutely absurd. If we are only calm, if that's the only thing we are, we're not paying attention. If we're not enraged with the ravage that's happening to the planet, if we're not enraged with the evisceration of the middle class, if we're not enraged and weeping about the condition of children in cages at the border, then we are not paying attention. If we only retreat to our analysis and our reason, then we are not embracing the totality of our humanity. With that, I'll agree. And that said, for me personally, I think I'm similar in this way to most human beings. For me to do anything particularly strategic, for me to really help anyone, for me to be able to figure out the next several things to do, what might be a few smart moves, I got to take a breath. I got to count to 5. I got to scan the room, and I got to try to figure out what's going on. I do appreciate your call. We'll keep trying to figure out what's going on. Next listener, winner of the Most Patient Listener Award, Stella from Providence. Go ahead, Stella.
Hi, I was calling in response to your request for a substitution for a conservative.
Thank you.
I've been saying this for 10 years, regressive.
And the nice thing about regressive is it still starts with R. You can put R in a parentheses next to it and it still sort of seems like the same thing.
and then while I was listening and being infinitely patient, snark, I heard you mention looking for a word for populism. It's more like tribalism on steroids, you know?
You know what I like? Stella, I like both of those words. I really appreciate your call, and I wish we would have talked 10 years ago. I think regressive works. It also works because it applies to taxation, and regressive versus progressive actually talks about pretty quickly about the difference in tax policy for at least most people in those. Go ahead.
The rant that I initially had regarding regressivism was just, the inappropriate nomenclature of the word conservative, when what are these people conserving? Only their wealth and power and that of their donors.
Yeah.
They aren't conserving the environment. They aren't conserving the economy. They aren't conserving, the welfare of the nation by any means.
Yeah, and still, this is exact. I'll just say amen. This is exactly why I asked the question. I'll say something else I like about the word regressive. Somebody last week proposed reactionary, and I'm still wrestling with that. It hasn't been. I haven't immediately glommed onto it because much of what's happening doesn't feel like merely a reaction. Very often it feels like a pro-action in favor of something that is lousy and working in favor of we'll call them regressive policies. So I like the word regressive and appreciate the call. And tribalism I also appreciate for a different reason. Stella, you may win Best Caller Award. I don't want to besmirch the callers previously, but there's a chance you'll win Best Caller Award. That award does not exist until this very moment. But also because very often we play the word thing. If we pick a word that doesn't feel accurate or only feels inflammatory, it seems less likely to catch on. Tribalistic is different than calling somebody a racist, and therefore I think it's been hard for people just to call Donald Trump a racist in lots of media channels.
I mean, it's kind of a substitute for white nationalism.
Yeah.
And I'm a Mayflower descendant. I'm whiter than white.
You live in Providence.
What?
Yeah, you live in Providence.
Yeah. Finest in inbreeding, I swear.
Stella, thank you so much for the call. Let's go to Leslie, also, who's been waiting patiently from Central Square, New York, apparently.
Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Leslie.
I want to talk about something that happened in 2008.
Pause for just a second. We'll take you after the break. Thank you so much. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith, taking your calls, and we'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. 202-808-9925. My name's Jeff. Leslie, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Thank you. In 2008, I was listening to Glenn Beck on the radio, and he said that he was going to have to take off his TV shows and probably his radio because he was scared that Barack Obama was going to put the fairness doctrine back in. That's how good the fairness doctrine is. They're gone. Fox will be gone and everything if it's put back in. That's a fact. And we won't stop the brainwashing of this country. But no, corporate Democrats don't want it.
It's a good question.
Obama and Clinton.
Yeah, I actually want to do some more research before understanding all of the forces to and fro. I think you're right that the biggest corporate forces don't want to mess with regulations on what they do. And let me also say, if that meant that next to me, and I'll acknowledge my own, where I come from politically, if that meant that I had to sit next to somebody who disagreed with me politically, or that had to be followed by somebody. And what that meant was we could have an honest discussion of what was really going on in this country, and we could have an honest discussion to make sure we had fact-based policymaking. We replied to climate change based on facts. I would take that deal 7 days a week, twice on Sunday. And you think the primary thing is just connected essentially to the dominance of money on our political apparatus, which is why that even Barack Obama was unable or unwilling to change it.
Yeah, because of money.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll say
That's disgusting.
I'll say here's a thing. And the good news is in New York, y'all are taking a step. And I think that step is helpful in things like building the kind of political apparatus and the kind of political culture that can elect in a Democratic primary someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And not just have Michael Bloomberg's, who for all his beneficence with his philanthropy, including being one of the not very many hopes in us doing something, in financial hopes of having organizations have support who want to do something about the scourge of gun violence. Nonetheless, he had to spend, what was it, $40 a vote? I mean, he spent tens of millions of dollars on becoming mayor of New York. That New York has instituted public financing, a 6-to-1 match in the city of New York. Used to just be a 1-to-1 match, which didn't help people win very much. But a 6-to-1 match is meant that you don't have to have the support of oligarchs and you have a chance to win. The state of New York has been trying to pick that up also. That is something, by the way, that our fair and good and decent and righteous activist Thom Hartmann listeners could do in your cities. You could pass public financing. It's a little harder to do in states, but it can be done in states. Still worth trying in states. Blue states will want to do it. There'll be budget challenges, and they'll argue about the budget as a proxy for not wanting to open up democracy. In cities, it's not as expensive. There's not as many races. And you can get it done. Portland, Oregon just did it. There are other cities who can do it also. If you're looking at those things, I'm going to add that. It's actually already on my list of ways to apply energy. That you might not be able to pick the president. Tom Steyer decided the best way for him to pick the president, despite having tens of millions of dollars to put into the political process, he decided the best way to do that was for himself to run. Most of our listeners are not going to run for president. I think we have about as many candidates as the debate stage can fill. In fact, in the future, it's probably going to get a little smaller. But each of you can work to address money in politics in your own jurisdiction. Each of you can make sure that underrepresented voices are subsidized. And each of you can make sure that when there is a debate, it's more likely to happen based on the facts and less likely to be based just on the bribe. That is one thing that each of us can do in so many jurisdictions around this country. We'll have that and more coming up after this. I'm Jeff. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. This is Thom Hartmann's show, and it's your show. And let's do a speed round. Let's try to clear the board before the next break. That is our game. Let's go to Ivan first. Ivan from Illinois, go ahead.
Jefferson, my man, I love to give the right, a taste of the old medicine.
All right.
Whenever I share a post that's about Trump's malfeasance, I keep my comment short and sweet, all caps. Lock him up. And when I tweet or retweet some lie, I always add hashtag lock him up. This drives the right-wing trolls crazy, and they attack me unmercifully, which I love.
Well, I appreciate your willingness to take the attacks, Ivan. John, you're watching Free Speech TV from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the Republicans are radicals. They're not really reactionary. They're not wanting to go back to any former point in history. They want to remake this country in their own image, which means a helpless, defenseless population that is just at their beck and call. And, since Ronald Reagan, they've actually been able to accomplish quite a bit in that respect. We have the Fourth Estate, which is in shambles because it's just propaganda. And we cannot have a truth-free democracy. The Founding Fathers talked about that. Yep. And, the dictatorships of the 20th century, the Nazis, Mussolini, and then also the totalitarian regime in Russia proved that propaganda is how you can control people. And, this is where we're at. And we were sold by both parties. And I would say the Democrats, the leadership of the Democratic Party needs to be changed. and they are doing their best to prevent that. And I'm talking about.
Well, let's do in the speed round. Let's do 1 point per. But I do want to write it down to reply to reply to your second comment. I'll react to the radical part. One of the reasons I really like Stella's regressive, and thank you again, Stella, is that when we use, and I think you're right, that the challenge with saying reactionary is, well, they're not just reacting to stuff, they're proposing radical change. They're not, it's the same reason I don't think conservative applies. They're not being conserving anything. They're not trying to either conserve the environment or conserve a set of cherished ideas. They are pushing for radical change of the economy. It's just radical change of the economy that's good for too few people. But the reason I don't love using the word radical is that radicals in the 70s were some of our favorite people. And I think we also do need radical change. So we don't want to taint the word radical. So far, I'm liking that regressive, appreciating your call. I'll make a comment. I'll reply on changing leadership maybe later. My quick tease, spoiler alert, I think the way that you change political leadership is not only through trying to get somebody different to be Speaker of the House. Right. I think the way you change political leadership is by changing the context of the country. That if you were going to prioritize what you're going to send letters to your city council people to advocate for publicly financed elections. Send letters to your state legislators to open up the elections process. If we have more democracy, we will have more small d Democratic elected leaders. I have more to say about that, but it's supposed to be speed round. Will, Salem, Oregon.
Hey, Jefferson, how are you? This is actually an important topic, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think it's not fluff stuff. The words we use in a big way. Anyway, right, they are not conservatives. I've been doing this for at least 10 years. What I would recommend is they're the grand old fill in your name party. Now that third word, you can say anything you want. You could say fascist. You could say Koch brothers. The grand old Koch brothers party, the grand old billionaires party, the grand old We Hate America party, but it's all set up. Just the grand old fill in your name party, and obviously they're not conservative. These are fascist reactionaries, Koch brothers. And anyway, that's my thought.
Will, appreciate it so much. Dave from Armstrong Creek, Wisconsin. Go ahead, Dave.
Hi. I just want to point out that since the Reagan presidency, and even a little bit before that, the supply-side economics that went on were destroying labor unions and freezing wages, basically, and the loss of jobs set this all up for Trump getting elected. He told everybody what they wanted to hear, and they believed him. And I think people, they hate to admit to themselves that they made a mistake, that they're willing to go along with anything, all the lies that he tells and everything like that. I listen to Washington Journal in the morning, and
we're in speed round, so
right,
make the key point you want to make.
It's so predictable about they're willing to let things that he says go, just for the sake of being in denial that they made a mistake putting this man in.
No, there's huge cognitive dissonance going on. And one of the reasons why the attack on Trump doesn't make people change their mind about Trump is that they've made their decision, and that feels like an attack on their own judgment, on their own wisdom. It's a little bit like the argument John Kerry made about the Vietnam War. Who will be the last person to die for a mistake? It's a similar sunk cost fallacy challenge. Leo at Speed Round from Portland, Oregon. I know Portland.
Hi, how are you?
Doing good. We got about 30 seconds.
Okay, so my thing that's just got me going is that we are playing into the Republicans' wedge issue thing, with refugees drinking out of toilets and making that like the main news story for days and weeks at a time. We let them prioritize our attention on less important issues that don't or shouldn't affect us directly. I mean, I don't want refugees getting out of toilets, but we're still spending millions and losing lives on war. The environment is going on. The country's roads and bridges are falling apart. And we get so outraged that, what's going on at the border that we have we wound up giving a windfall to the people that are doing it, saying that $750 a head or whatever it is, whatever astronomical amount it is, isn't enough. Let's earmark $4.5 billion more if I was running a scam getting, foster kids, and I got 1,000 foster kids and starved them and treated them like slaves,
Leah, we're going to break. Want to say thank you for the calls. Thanks, everybody. 202-808-9925.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
202-808-9925. We're going to be talking to Tim Wise later about how do we respond? What's the best way to pivot or to address racism in the country?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Our book today is Us Versus Them, The Failure of Globalism by Ian Bremmer. This is from Chapter 1, titled Winners and Losers. It's time for a local revolution, the candidate told the roaring crowd. Countries are no longer nations, but markets. Borders are erased. Everyone can come to our country, and this has cut our salaries and our social protections. This dilutes our cultural identity. Marine Le Pen's 4 sentences capture every important element of the anxiety rising across the Western world. The borders are open and the foreigners are coming. They'll steal your job. They will cost you your pension and your health care by bankrupting your system. They will pollute your culture. Some of them are killers. Le Pen fell short in her bid to become France's president in 2017, but her message remains compelling for the 21st century politics of us versus them. But this is not a story about Marine Le Pen or Donald J. Trump or any of the other populist powerhouses who have emerged in Europe and the United States in recent years. Spin the camera toward the furious crowd. There's the real story. It's not the messenger that drives this movement. It's the fears, often, if not always, justified, of ordinary people. Fears of lost jobs, surging waves of strangers, vanishing national identities, and the incomprehensible public violence associated with terrorism. It's the growing doubt among citizens that government can protect them, provide them with opportunities for a better life, and help them remain the masters of their fate. As of December 2015, just 6% of people in the United States, 4% in Germany, 4% in Britain, and 3% in France believe the world is getting better. The pessimistic majority suspects that those with power, money, and influence care more about their cosmopolitan world than they do about their fellow citizens. Many citizens of these countries now believe that globalization works for the favored few, but not for them. And they have a point. Globalization, the cross-border flow of ideas, information, money, people, goods, and services, has resulted in an interconnected world where national leaders have increasingly limited ability to protect the lives and livelihoods of their citizens. In the digital age, borders no longer mean what citizens think they mean. In some ways, they barely exist. Globalism, the belief that the interdependence that created globalization is a good thing, is indeed the ideology of the elite. Political leaders of the wealthy West have been globalism's biggest advocates, building a system that has propelled ideas, information, people, money, goods, and services across borders at a speed and on a scale without precedent in human history. Sure, more than 1 billion people have risen from poverty in recent decades, and economies and markets have come a long way from the financial crisis. But along with new opportunities come serious vulnerabilities, and the refusal of the global elite to acknowledge the downsides of the new interdependence confirms the suspicions of those losing their sense of security and standard of living that elites in New York and Paris have more in common with elites in Rome and San Francisco than with their discarded countrymen in Tulsa, Turin, Tuscaloosa, and Toulon. The globalists gutted the American working class and created a middle class in Asia, former White House strategist Steve Bannon told The Hollywood Reporter a few days after Donald Trump's 2016 election victory. The issue is now about Americans looking not to get effed over. End of quote. In the United States, the jobs that once lifted generations of Americans into the middle class and kept them there for life are vanishing. Crime and drug addiction are rising. While 87% of Chinese and 74% of Indians told pollsters in 2017 that they believe their country is moving in the right direction, only 43% of Americans said the same thing. In Europe, the European Commission and the unelected bureaucrats who enforce its rules have legislated for its 28 member nations without understanding their very needs. In recent years, they've failed to halt a debt crisis that has forced many Europeans to accept lower wages, higher prices, later retirement, less generous pensions, and an uncertain future, all while telling them that they must bail out foreign countries that have spent their way into debt. In the migrant crisis, globalist European leaders insisted that all EU members must accept Muslim refugees in numbers determined in Brussels, and barricades and a spike in nationalism were the result. I'm defining nationalism here as one form of us versus them intended to rally members of one nation against those of other nations. Were the wave of populist nationalism sweeping the United States and Europe only signs of globalism's failure, it would be bad enough. But there's a larger crisis coming. Many of the storms creating turmoil in the U.S. and Europe, particularly technological change in the workplace, broader awareness of income inequality, are now headed across borders and into the developing world, where governments and institutions are not ready. Developing countries are especially vulnerable because the institutions that create stability in developing countries are not as sturdy, and social safety nets aren't nearly as strong as in the United States and the European Union. They face an even bigger gap between rich and poor, and the reality that new technologies will kill large numbers of jobs that lifted expectations for a better life will be much harder to manage. In short, just as the financial crisis had a cascading effect through financial markets and real economies around the world, so the sources of anger convulsing Europe and America will send shockwaves through dozens of other countries. Some will absorb these shocks, some of them won't. As poorer people in developing countries become more aware of what they're missing or losing, many will pick up rocks. The book, Us Versus Them by Ian Bremmer.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Howdy, everybody. We'll acknowledge the tragic, evil news out of the Gilroy Garlic Festival with a shooting where 4 people are dead, including the murderer. And a reminder, he is not merely a shooter. Hashtag watch your language. He is a murderer. A shooter, you can do that in a video game. The murderer reminds us of the humanity of the people who are most at issue here, which is not merely the person holding the gun, who is not the hero in the story. Dan Coates, removed as intelligence director, apparently too much of a patriot, apparently believed to too great a degree that the purpose of national intelligence was to defend the nation. He has been replaced by Representative Ratcliffe, who appealed apparently to Donald Trump during his hard questioning of Robert Mueller. We had a caller before the break who said something that I think is one of the hardest strategic things for progressives to address. And that is, here's the dynamic. We know, and we just know, that the conservative movement picks wedge issues. And the definition of a wedge issue is something that divides a little bit some segment of voters in a Democratic, big D Democratic coalition. For instance, if you have a strategy to win Rust Belt states, if you want to win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and hold on to Ohio when you're a Republican, then you recognize that a bunch of white voters there. And so do something that, might divide white voters, might appeal to some white voters and drive a wedge between people who identify themselves as white voters versus people who do not identify themselves as white voters, either because they try to identify themselves primarily through their color or because they aren't white. And this is not too different a move than when there was focus on bathrooms or when there was focus on same-sex marriage. It's not too different a move than when there was focus on women's right to choose. Because you got to figure out a way to get poorer people to vote for a platform that helps concentration of wealth among the very few. And we know that's been a move that's going on for a long time. That fire didn't just get lit. And the challenge is, what do we do? Because in the social media age, as I opened the show with, the power of the bully pulpit is to pick the fight. The power of the bully pulpit is not only to say the thing and have a lot of people see that thing, but it's to trigger the responses, because that's what triggers the algorithms. That's what garners attention in an attention economy. It's not enough just to preach from the pulpit. You've got to get Hoseas and Hosannas. You've got to get people preaching back. And that includes, for algorithms, disagreeing and being grumpy back. And all that does is make sure more people see your thing, and you then get to jump off of just the social media, and you get Al Sharpton to be the lead story in the morning. So what do you do about it? What is the response? You can't just say, well, having jingoistic, ethnocentric, racist border policies is okay. You can't just be quiet about that. But I think you can continue to focus on the biggest priorities you want to focus upon. For me, it's three big things. It is massive wealth disparities, it is the erosion of the planet, and it is democracy, which includes fundamental dignity and equality. It's save the middle class, save democracy, and save the planet. I can think of more than three things, but I can always remember three things. And for me, I think it's okay for us to prioritize. I think it is morally permissible, and I think it's also strategically important to not forget. You don't have to change your view. You don't have to disregard. You don't have to be silent upon. You don't have to fail to respond to cruelty in any of its forms. But you're also allowed to return to pivot to stay focused upon your primary objectives and make sure those primary objectives have a path to accomplishment, have a path to making people's lives better. One of the things we're talking about today is language, how we talk about this stuff. I raised the question, I've been struggling with what do we want to call conservatives, what do we want to use instead of populism. I'm going to I think there are a couple more calls. I'll continue that speed round. Then we'll probably change the subject because one thing I want to make sure we get to, in addition to Tim Wise, who we're going to be talking to about how do you defeat Trump and using the history of David Duke, the defeat of David Duke, as an analogy to how do you defeat Donald Trump. But I also want to talk about the strategic map, where I think folks can be spending energy. If we believe it, when Thom says democracy is not a spectator sport, when he says tag your it, that doesn't just mean it's your time to, say something to a neighbor. I hope it means that. But also for us to do things. What are the things to do? Other than sending $3 to the presidential candidate who sends you an email. What are the things to do? I want to offer that list. But we'll continue the speed round with, let's go, who do I want to go here? Oh, yeah, let's go, Zach. Go ahead, speak your piece.
Is that me?
That's you, Zach, from North Hollywood.
Hey, good to speak with you, Jeff. I'm going to keep this as short as possible because I would love your response on this. We reaffirm racism on a daily basis, hundreds and hundreds of times, by the language we use.
Yeah.
And would you agree that a colloquialism is a term that is so embedded in our daily language as to be almost impossible to remove or replace? Something that's been used for years. I have a suggestion that we change the colloquial name of the executive mansion to the public house. The pub for short, reducing the normal call-out letters, the call-out syllables by one. What do you think of that?
I'll take it.
Call it the pub.
I was thinking of it just the other day, right? I mean, we got white papers, White House, and if
we
don't
reaffirm it hundreds of times a day. The White House, think of it.
Right. And I think, and the people who really investigate language and connect language to oppression see how much there is, right? I mean, even like, dark territory, dark topics, the darkness of our souls. I use that language too, and I won't fully remove it from my lexicon. But where we can together identify places that could be easily renamed, I like the public house. I like if we added a bar that made sure people didn't get drunk and drive there. But if we added some kind of gathering place where people could participate that wasn't just a gift shop, then I think it actually might take hold. And so you could gather to the pub, and the pub in the United States meant democracy. I'm picking up what you're putting down, man.
Yeah. All right, man. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Zach. Paul, waiting patiently. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, Jefferson, I wanted to talk about evangelical Christianity, and there was talking earlier about the beginnings of Rush Limbaugh, but it started way before that. It was more than 15. more than 15 years. Well, actually, evangelical Christianity started 150 years ago in this country, but in modern times, in modern media, this started in about the early 70s. The Koch brothers started funding these TV evangelists that we've all been familiar with, and this was leading up to, as Tom has talked about, the Koch brothers and their libertarian platform in the 1980 election. They started 10 years before that, and what happened is they bought up pretty much all of the television airtime with these evangelical preachers, and drove all of the denominational Christian shows off the air because the denominational churches could not anywhere near keep up with the amount of money the Koch brothers were throwing at the television time. And at that time, denominational Christianity in this country was generally liberal. And all you need to do to convince yourself of that is watch 1960s television. I'm talking about shows like Bonanza, where all of these issues, racism, bigotry, big business taking over. There's a Bonanza episode to address almost all of these things. Remember that these TV shows are reflecting what America believes, not telling them what to believe. And so in the 1960s, remember, the House of Representatives, the Democrats owned the Congress, and even through Nixon's presidency. But when the Koch brothers came along, threw money at right-wing television, what they're trying to do is use Christianity, distorted, corrupted Christianity, to convince people that the right-wing way to go was the moral and Christian thing to do.
Yep.
And they did nothing but corrupt it completely. And you notice now there's still no denominational television on Christian television. It's all either TV evangelist preachers. Every Elmer Gantry in the world is on TV. Joel Osteen, all these people. There's no Christian message. It's all of this condemnation. And
no, I hear you, and we've talked about it on the program. And let me go you one better, Paul. So and let me say that it's often said that Polite Company does not talk about politics or religion. We on this show always talk about politics. We will now violate the second precept and talk about religion. That if you want to go back a little bit further, it was there are multiple trigger points. One of those trigger points was, in fact, Brown versus Board of Education. And even also after the Powell memo and the rise of Koch brothers funding. I mean, the history of the right wing is so important to understand, and something that I think when people say mainstream media, it's one of the big stories that is still underappreciated, is still undercovered, because it's so easy to talk about sort of both sides, and well, there's two political parties, same as there have been for a while, and you fail to connect enough of the dots. But if you go back, I think I will talk about religion after the break and violate that second precept. But very quickly, after Brown versus Board of Education was taking Southern Christians as justifications who had to figure out how to justify slavery, and then taking that idea of religion, taking it away from the progressives nationwide.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Yeah, after the break, I'm going to talk about religion. 202-808-9925. All right, folks. Thanks for watching on Free Speech TV. Let me say something about religion. And for the folks who are watching on YouTube, watching us on Facebook, you'll be able to catch this. For some of the folks on broadcast, I'll have to repeat a shortened version of it. The progressive movement was built on the backs of Presbyterians. The abolitionist movement was built with work of Christians. The church was the gathering place for the public interest. The progressive movement generally significantly was built by people recognizing that one of the forces to oppose in the worst parts of industrialization-funded purchase of democracy was, in fact, Christian faith. In this country, that was what most of the people in the United States were Christians. And it was rooted in, progressivism was built in Christian faith, at least two big things happened. One big thing that happened was desegregation. One big thing that happened was white racists realizing the country was no longer sufficiently on their side. And it was, George Wallace was no longer socially acceptable to run for president, expect to win the nomination of a major party, and say the words, "I am a racist, there should be segregation in this country," and think you'd win in either party. You had to use code words. The best code words, the orators who'd been figuring out the best way to tangle Christian morality to justify immoral things, people who were most skillful at that, were in fact Southern preachers who had for decades figured out how to use the Word of God, how to use the Bible. More specifically, figure out how to either use or avoid the New Testament to allow and justify slavery, and then after that, allow and justify Jim Crow, and then after that, allow and justify privatization of schools so that white kids didn't have to go to the same schools as black kids. That the rise of the Christian right was the rise of the racist Christian right. That's what's actually going on. That it was Darby? I think it was Darby who preached premillennialism instead of post-millennialism. Christians have been a source of good and peace so that Jesus would return. The idea is that Jesus would return after 1,000 years, after a millennium of peace. And so Christians say, hey, if we ever want Jesus to come back, we got to work really hard to get 1,000 years of peace. Well, the Darby folks, the rapturists, they believed that Jesus would come back when stuff was really bad. That there would be 1,000 years of peace after Jesus came back. And Jesus would only come back after things were really, really bad. So you couldn't work. It was a waste of time to some degree to work to make the world better. Instead, just convert people and wait for the rapture, wait for Jesus. Nuclear era doesn't matter. Climate change doesn't matter. Holocaust doesn't matter. Religion was changed in its application to politics. And we got to understand that. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Show. We've got Bob Ney on the line, Talk Media News, talkmedianews.com. We've already talked about Gilroy and already talked about Dan Coates being removed as intelligence director. What else you got for us, good sir? Bob, you there?
Yes. Hi, Jefferson. How about the Iran nuclear deal?
Please.
Well, we all know a couple of things. We know that Secretary of State Pompeo had said what to us a few months ago. He was going to Europe, having very intense discussions with our allies in Europe, and that would garnish support to help the United States to oppose Iran. And then, of course, we heard from John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, who's never seen a country he doesn't want to bomb, that, of course, Iran would fear and would have to have regime change and on and on and on. And this was all as a result of course, a change from the Secretary of State Tillerson, who encouraged the president to stay in the Iran nuclear deal. And then it went to Bolton and Pompeo, and the rest is history. Well, having said all of that, there was a meeting, and it was diplomats from Iran, Germany, France, Britain, China, Russia, and the European Union, and they recommitted yesterday to saving Tehran's 2015 nuclear deal after very constructive talks in Vienna. This is according to the Associated Press, and it's from both sides, both all the countries I mentioned and the Iranians itself. Now, why is this a big deal? Because there's a lot of tension, obviously, between the West and Iran, and a United Kingdom British tanker was taken. We got pretty upset about it, but it seems like the United Kingdom isn't as upset as we are and is negotiating, about that situation with the tanker, but proceeded on diplomatically. So my whole point to this is a next general strategy, which would be for the European Union to set up payment systems to keep doing business with Iran, therefore going around American sanctions and basically, Jefferson, sort of isolating the United States. So all of the plans and all of the coalitions, et cetera, obviously have failed when it comes to basically most of the rest of the world in dealing with Iran.
I appreciate that. And I recognize this is to some degree a different topic, but what impact do you see on American policy, on American strategy for the change with Dan Coats out as intelligence director? Maybe with respect to Iran, but also generally.
Well, I think in general, Dan Coats, as we know, had disagreements with the president on, certain ways to handle, issues, especially particularly Russia. But like anything, when Tillerson left, who, by the way, I and many other people in the media were not particularly fans of his, but he actually kind of grew on people to be more of a moderate. So the president's already, announced he's got a choice, that he's made. Of course, it was Ratliff who was very, very big, supporting him recently with the Robert, Mueller deal. And so I think it does make a difference because as Pompeo came in and Tillerson left, and as obviously John Bolton came in, the entire system within the White House went to the right of the right of the right, the neocon hawkish side. So if, in fact, the president, has someone else in this position taking Dan Coats' position, it could just further veer it to the right. And why is that worth mentioning? Because you've asked the right question. There are forces within the White House, I want to note, and this is something I know from context. There are forces in the White House who are trying to go the other direction. So it's sort of like this, chess game. Those in the White House who want to, not push all the buttons to begin world conflicts, and then new people who you can bet that the influence of people like Pompeo and John Bolton will be there to try to get the most hawkish choices. So it's sort of an internal struggle, and I think it's very important to us and to world stability.
Yeah, and Trump's move, it's baffling. It can be baffling and disorienting because it feels so foreign. It feels so atypical. But it's not that complicated. Trump punishes enemies and rewards friends. And we thought that in liberal democracies we were supposed to do things to some degree based on reason, based on merit, based on some shared understanding of the good. And Trump sets that aside and says, "Oh, this person said something nice to me and about me and did something nice for me. This person isn't always on my side. I'm going to pick this person rather than that person." That dynamic is always there in politics. With Trump, he is sort of the apotheosis. He's sort of the pinnacle of that. What is the response like? Like, does Ratcliffe have any bona fides to be the head of national intelligence?
I really don't think so. He supported the president pretty good, didn't he, on the committee? That's probably enough. He asked the right questions.
Be tough on TV and look like you're not going to investigate Russia.
Right, tough on TV, and so I think that does it, because you make a very good point. With the president in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it's not all his son-in-law and his closeness to Mohammed bin Salman, but it's also when the president went there, and I had a Saudi friend tell me this, they had TV sets every 1,000 feet. They had him on TV, they had this, they had that, the whole pomp and circumstance, and it impresses him, and just as you said, that becomes his friend. And I think with this, he watched the performance of obviously a Ratliff on television and liked it, because how quick did he name the replacement to Coats? The ink wasn't dry on the letter.
Bob Ney, as always, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Let me come back to that point very briefly. Understand game theory. This is simple stuff. It's not easy. It's not, and it's not easy to deal with, but it's simple. In game theory, when they played the prisoner's dilemma, and the idea was you win if you defect. If you're sort of a jerk and the other person cooperates with you, you win. If you both defect, you both lose. If you both cooperate, you can win. That's the basic payout structure of the prisoner's dilemma. If you've seen Beautiful Mind, they cover it. It's the movie with Russell Crowe. And what they learned by playing lots and lots and lots of iterations is that one of the most effective ways to win the prisoner's dilemma, to win that kind of game, is with a tit-for-tat strategy. If somebody does something jerky to you, the next move, you do something jerky to them. And every time, you're always jerky to them. And if they're nice, you're nice. The modified tit-for-tat tends to be a little bit better than tit-for-tat. The world is not a prisoner's dilemma. We need leaders who don't just do tit-for-tat, but understand that's Donald Trump's move. We should learn from it, hopefully not merely replicate it.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
You know, every day here on the Thom Hartmann Program, Louise and I and our team, Sean, Nate, Shira, Dave, Chase, Sue, Nigel, Ron, we all work to put together the very, very best show we possibly can. And there's an enormous amount of work that goes into the show. And one of the things that comes out of that is a lot of content, a lot of specific information that we go through and we dig out and, we want to share with you. And Sue puts that into our newsletter every week. And I think you will, if you don't already receive our newsletter, it comes in email every day, about an hour after we're off the air, or maybe a couple hours after we're off the air. And Sue goes through and pulls literally every link to every story that we talked about and puts it into the newsletter. It's free. We don't sell a list or anything. You complete safety and security. There's no charge. There's no nothing. Just, plug in your email address over at thomhartmann.com. And you get signed up for the newsletter. It's all fairly obvious. You'll see it on the website. So check it out, thomhartmann.com. Thank you. Thom Hartmann University Book Club today. We're reading from It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America by David K. Johnston. This is from page 61, the chapter titled Forgetting the Forgotten Man. In 2010, the U.S. Department of Labor created a website to honor workers who died on the job. Quote, more than 4,500 workers, lose their lives on the job every year. Below are the names of just a few who have died in recent months. OSHA's mission is to prevent workplace injuries, illnesses, and death, end quote. That Occupational Safety and Health Administration webpage was intended to highlight and humanize workplace deaths, to ensure awareness of tragedies, especially those that could have been avoided, according to Jordan Barab, an Assistant Secretary of Labor during the Obama administration. Barab explained, without information like this, fatality statistics are just raw, sterile numbers. The purpose of adding names and circumstances was to impress people with the tragedy that workers and their families face day after day. In August 2017, Trump's Labor Department quietly removed the preamble and the names when it killed the web page. It also took down, without public announcement, the fatality inspection data for all years prior to 2017. Those were just two of many other Trump administration actions inimical to worker safety. Others included no longer posting press releases about deaths resulting from unsafe working conditions, delaying rules to reduce sickness and death from inhaling silica and beryllium at work, delaying rules to lower the risk of railroad engineers and truck drivers falling asleep at the switch or wheel because of untreated sleep apnea, and the appointment to the Supreme Court of a judge who held that a company had the right to fire a worker who chose not to freeze to death on the job. A reasonable person listening to Donald Trump's inaugural address would never have expected these and other actions, assuming he believed what Trump said. Trump declared, "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no more. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens," end quote. Those men and women were forgotten again the following week. And it's not just workers whose interests were forgotten, not to mention who were put in danger. By deciding not to implement a rule to reduce the chances of truck drivers and train operators falling asleep at the wheel, Trump put at risk the lives of families driving along the highway, people riding on passenger trains, and many others. The White House called it President Trump's war on regulation. In his weekly radio address in early May, he declared that we've removed one job-killing regulation after another, and they're not pretty, and they're going. And believe me, we're just getting started on regulations. They're gone. Removal of data on workplace deaths, which averaged 13 per day, infuriated Jordan Barab, who was Obama's number 2 at OSHA. As a private citizen, Barab created a web page to keep track of the names of the dead and the reasons they were killed on the job. He called it, "OSHA won't tell you who died in the workplace, we will." After the election, Barab's concerns that the Trump administration would be bad for workers increased when he asked where the Trump beachhead team was and learned that none was coming. Each incoming administrator sends people to scope out federal agencies, learn who does what, and get a feel for the place in advance. Then the incoming administration sends its landing team, the people who will initially implement its policies for each agenda or at each agency. When no beachhead team came up, Barab figured it meant worker safety simply was not a priority for Trump. He hoped that was the worst of it, nothing more than apathy about worker safety. But when the landing team arrived, Barab realized trouble was coming for American workers, and it was not official apathy, but the start of assaults on workers' rights and safety. Barab said most of them had no idea they were going to labor and no interest in workers' issues either. What they did have was a mandate to delay, repeal, or weaken regulations that protected workers as part of Trump's plan to eliminate, quote, any regulation that is outdated, unnecessary, bad for workers, or contrary to the national interest, end quote. The first sign came when Trump nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Gorsuch was an acolyte of Antonin Scalia, whose seat he would be taking. Like Scalia, he said statutes should be literally read, and if that made no sense, well, that was a problem for Congress. Also like Scalia, he had a habit of consulting dictionaries, often following Scalia's practice of relying on the third, fourth, or even lesser definition of a word when it supported his jurisprudence. Trump's nomination alarmed unions. Jody Calamine, a communications worker of America lawyer, told Gorsuch's Senate confirmation hearing that Gorsuch, quote, is a threat to working people's health and safety, end quote. Calamine cited Gorsuch's dissent in the 2016 case to make his point. That dissent, he said, reveals an anti-worker bias and features a judicial activism that will ultimately put workers' lives at risk, end quote. Those are unusually strong words about a Supreme Court nominee, but a review of the case shows Gorsuch has little regard for human life, at least when it comes to employers' power over their workers. He considers a rigid interpretation of the law more important. The case was about a law Congress passed giving workers the right to refuse dangerous tasks. Gorsuch said, no, you may not refuse. It's even worse than you think, by David K. Johnston.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Howdy, everybody. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith, sitting in, honored to do so. On the line, we have Tim Wise. Tim Wise first got to my attention through one of the best explanations of connecting the current political dynamic to the racist origins and present of our country that I've ever seen, and helped set a tone for white allies as well as anyone I have seen. It's someone I've learned from and try to learn from more. I've never had a chance to talk to him before. Honored to have a chance to talk to him now. He had a thread that a bunch of people paid attention to, and I had multiple people ask me, did you see it? Did you see it? And I said, yeah, I saw it. And really glad to have the chance to ask him about that, where he essentially took lessons from running against David Duke, or helping the campaign to defeat David Duke, and thinking about how those lessons can be, might be, should be translated to the campaign against Donald Trump. Online right now, we have Tim Wise. Good to talk to you, sir.
Good to talk to you. Thanks.
Give us the background on the David Duke campaign, and then let's talk about what you learned from it.
Sure. So, a lot of people don't really remember this, but it's been almost 30 years. David Duke, former leader of the largest Ku Klux Klan group in the U.S., really a white supremacist and modern Nazi for all of his adult life, was running for the United States Senate in Louisiana in 1990 and then governor in 91. He had already been elected to the Louisiana State House in an election in 1989. And there were several of us at the time. There was an organization formed specifically for the purpose of defeating him, a PAC that was not going to work with any existing candidate, but the whole purpose of which was really to defeat Duke in that Senate race at first, and then later the governor's race. And I was hired as the campus coordinator, later became associate director of that group. And at the time, what Duke was doing was taking sort of the dog whistle racism that had really been quite common in American politics, at least since Wallace and Nixon, if not quite a bit earlier than that, and beginning to really bullhorn that racism, not playing nearly as many games, still trying to cover up his intent, but doing so in a way that was only, pretty transparent.
Not just saying states' rights.
Yeah, no. It was much more blatant. He was, he was saying people's taxes are too high because we're spending all this money on those people for welfare, or the reason you don't have a job is because a black person took it because of affirmative action, or an immigrant took it. The reason you're afraid to go out at night is because of black criminals. I mean, he was much more blatant. And he was using this politics of prejudice and racial scapegoating to lure white voters in Louisiana to him. And it worked in a lot of ways. I mean, he got in that U.S. Senate race 44% of the vote overall, 60% of the white vote. In the governor's race the next year, he got 39% of the total, 55% of the white vote. So in both elections, the majority of white people ratified a guy who they knew was a Nazi. It wasn't a mystery. It's not that they didn't know. They knew and they did not care. And as I've looked at Trump, I realize, obviously, Donald Trump is not the same as David Duke. I realize there are very serious distinctions. David Duke is actually a National Socialist, and I don't believe Donald Trump is. But they are both tapping into the same vein of white racial resentment and using a politics of prejudice and racial scapegoating to catapult themselves to power. In the case of Donald Trump, I don't think that we have applied some of those lessons that a few of us, at least in Louisiana, learned in 90 and 91 in figuring out how to respond to him. And I was worried when I posted the 34-tweet Twitter thread a week ago that the current sort of Democratic Party approach and the candidates' approach is to treat this almost like any other campaign. Here are our wonderful policy ideas. Here's what we're going to do on health care. Here's what we're going to do to make college affordable. And the problem is we're talking about Trump and Trumpism. Trumpism is not a movement that came to power on the basis of ideas and logic and people sitting down and looking at position papers and going, oh, I think I like this better than this. Fascism is not a fact-based movement. It is an emotion-driven movement. And to bring spreadsheets to a gunfight, which is what I think the Democrats are doing, is not going to drive the base to the polls, and it is certainly not going to get those reasonable moderates, independents, and Republicans to vote against Trump. So I think that there's a real danger here that hasn't been learned from the Duke years. And the case, a portion of the case you made was every time we focus our critique on some other thing, it almost is like we make equivalent his, you didn't use this example, but his weave comb-over hairstyle with his racism. If we just pile on a set of critiques, then it seems like, well, it's just all a synonym for we don't like this guy, rather than trying to focus the nation on the racism of the man and the racism of his movement. And we have to put the focus there and rather than distract ourselves with other stuff. Right, and everyone has said from the beginning, we don't want to normalize Trump. Well, what could be more normalizing than to think you're going to beat him with your health care plan? I mean, that's exactly the way you would run against Ted Cruz. It's the same way you would run against Jeb Bush. It's the same way you would run against any Republican. That's normalizing him. And with Duke, we learned this the hard way. You know, I was involved in both the Senate race and the governor's race working against him. And in the Senate race, I'll be perfectly honest, and I talked about this in the thread in Washington Post, and I've talked about it all week. There were consultants, mainstream Democratic Party consultants, as well as conservatives within our own coalition who were very nervous about talking about Duke's politics of modern racism. They didn't mind, obviously, talking about the Klan and his Nazi connections, but they didn't want us to talk about his racial scapegoating, his modern politics, out of fear that that would provoke a backlash on the part of white voters who agreed with those politics. And so in the Senate race, they were telling us, look, you don't want to talk about that. What you should talk about is the fact that Duke paid his taxes late, or, you know, the fact that Duke skipped out of service in Vietnam, or the fact that Duke wrote a sex manual under a female pseudonym, which he actually did do, which is weird. I don't want to talk about that. But in any event, like, they told us, you got to talk about these other character things. And unfortunately, you know, they had a lot of clout. They had the polling that made it seem like that was a good strategy. And we tried it. And I think it muddled the debate, because if you're talking about this guy's a Nazi, oh, and by the way, he paid his taxes late, people hear that and go, wait, what? If he's a Nazi, why don't you just sort of stick on Nazi? It seems like you're throwing everything out there.
Understood.
And I think with Trump, we do the same thing. Oh, it's Russia. Oh, it's the fact that he's a grifter. Oh, it's the fact that he's got his hands in Saudi Arabia and all these places making money. Oh, and it's Jared, and it's Ivanka, and it's, you know, and at some point, people hear that and go, well, is this a moral thing, or do you just not like the guy? And I think if you have someone whose entire politic is about scapegoating, racism, bigotry, xenophobia, religious bigotry, you have to stay on that. It is a moral issue. Trumpism is an existential threat to the country.
We've got 1 minute, and my question is very long. And where I agree is in one of the pieces of your thread, you say we got to put the focus not just on David Duke or not just on Donald Trump, but the focus on us and how we need to, this is not who we are as a nation. This is not who we want to be. Our identity can't merely be our racial identity. It has to be our compassion identity, our loving identity, our identity to try to make the world a little bit better. Here is my quibble. So most of it I just read nodding, but here is what I still wrestle with, is that Donald Trump, and you already embedded it in your introductory remarks, that Donald Trump does not have the credential of being a former Grand Dragon of the KKK. And you know, he was not, David Duke was not just Robert Byrd, who was a minor KKK member as a younger man. He's not just a Food Network person who said the N-word. He had this credential. There is a debate right now about whether or not Donald Trump is racist. I think it's a debate kind of like climate change is a debate. I think it's a debate kind of like smoking causes cancer was in the 1970s. But nonetheless, much of the argument is not assumed Donald Trump is racist. Most of the response is no, he's not. And I wonder if that changes strategic analysis. We got a few seconds. Last word for you.
It doesn't change it, because whether or not one believes Donald Trump is a racist, we ought to be able to look at how he's campaigning and what he is using as a tool. He is performing racism. And that makes it important.
Tim Wise, appreciate you. People can follow you on Twitter. Really appreciate your work and your time on the show today.
You bet. Thank you.
We'll be back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program, and we'll be back with your phone calls. I'm Jeff. Steve from Chicago, you win the Most Patient Listener Award. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you imagine the effects that having a guaranteed job at a living wage would make to the country?
It would be enormous. And in fact, one of the things I'm hoping, we might not be able to get to it until tomorrow, but there was just a Fox News host just came out and said, well, there should be no minimum wage in the country, and which I think belied much of the essential ideology of that movement. And and should be something we talk about more. But continue your point.
Okay. Well, first of all, it would set the base for a minimum wage, so wouldn't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
No one's going to work for anybody if they can get a guaranteed government job at a living wage. It would eliminate the need for most welfare. It would eliminate most poverty. It would eliminate a whole lot of homelessness. And it would eliminate one of the main reasons for racism is that these guys aren't going to take my job.
Connecting it, in fact, to the topic we were just on, connecting economic justice to racial justice, there was so much attempt to cleave those things apart during the analysis of the 2016 election. I think it was in significant part because it was so uncomfortable for a pundit with a large white audience and a large Trump voting audience to say racism. I think it was hard to say that. It's hard to say oligarchy when you work for an oligarch. But that there was this, there's the racist thing and there's the economics thing. I appreciate your connection of those two things. If we worked either way, if you worked on strengthening the middle class, building the middle class, bringing up minimum wage, and that was your number one thing, you'd have an enormous impact on racial wealth gaps and on racism generally. On the other way, focused on sort of the other side of that, I say united front. If you worked just on elevating the condition of people of color in our country, if you worked just on making sure that racial wealth gaps were addressed, you would do more to address wealth gaps generally than almost anything else you could do. And by the way, one of the things you end up doing is things like the minimum wage. This stuff is not separated. We are united in struggle. Our salvation is linked to the salvation of one another. If we work on fighting racism and work on fighting economic oppression, we can work on both things. And in fact, I would argue you can't work on only one of them at once. Mark from Burbank, California. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, hi, Jefferson. How you doing? I just wanted to tell you that I appreciate your thoughtfulness on the show always.
Thanks.
And I have a name other than regressives, which I think is great.
Yeah.
But this one is kind of based on the way people are being treated at the border, being caged and so on. I think a good name would be Repugnantkins.
It's wonderful, except I couldn't hear what you said. Repugnant?
Repugnantkins.
All right. Thank you, Mark, for the phone call. We've got just a few seconds. We'll be back in just a second. And Nancy, hang tight. I want to take your call. We'll wrap up the language thing. And then in the latter part, I want to get to that strategic map that I promised. I'll probably talk more about it also tomorrow. You're listening to The Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. Thanks also to the tweets. I'll be saying some of those. You can tweet at Thom Hartmann. You can also tweet at me, Jefferson D. Smith. And we'll be right back. Howdy, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I want to play a little clip, or rather, I want to ask Nate to play a little clip of something on Fox News last week. Nate, let's play that clip.
Representatives. So anyone who's making less than $15 an hour full time, that bill would elevate their wages.
But that's
to
fundamentally anti-American. That's
How is that
against
anti-American to give workers a wage?
Because that's ultimately because I mean, if you look at that system and you look at what is going on in America, you look at our capitalist system. The minimum wage should be zero.
Well, I don't want to get into minimum wage argument.
The minimum wage, according to that Fox News pundit, should be zero. Make no mistake, that was not a slip of the tongue. If you tease out the arguments that have motivated, that have militated the growth of the right-wing movement, not the growth of the Republican Party, but the growth of the right-wing movement that now owns and operates the Republican Party, to use Stella's term, the regressive movement, that in the era of sort of post-Ayn Rand, in the era of the Koch brothers, in the era of the prosperity gospel, in the era of the post-millennialists, versus the premillennialists, the folks who think that God will come after things are really, really bad, and therefore we don't have to use our Christian faith to try to make them better. We don't have to do things like fight for women's suffrage and fight for abolition of slavery and fight for public schools and fight for a minimum wage. All we have to do is convert people to Christianity, because eventually things will be so bad through climate change, nuclear war, that is when Jesus will come. And then we'll be saved. That that a necessary conclusion, or at least a natural conclusion, of the movement that has built the apparatus that right now controls the country includes the conclusion there should be no minimum wage. If you believe the market just figures everything out, that there is no market failure, that the invisible hand is so perfect, not only its in invisibility, but in its deftness, that everybody who's worth anything will make money according to their worth. And if you don't make a whole lot of money, it means you ain't worth much. Disregard the fact that almost everybody who got a job that makes a lot of money got a job because they knew somebody. Disregard the fact that how rich you already were or how rich your parents were is a huge predictor of how rich you're going to be. Disregard all the work to eviscerate the estate tax, the inheritance tax. Don't call it a death tax. Almighty God taxes everybody 100% at death. You can't take it with you. If you're going to call it something, call it a rich kid's tax. But if you're trying to be fair and accurate, call it an inheritance tax or an estate tax. Disregard that privilege is something that begets more privilege. The essential argument is if you don't have a lot of money, it's because you ain't worth much. And if that's the essential argument, you don't need, and if you are worth something, you'll be worth a lot. You'll make a lot of money. And if that's the essential argument, you don't need a minimum wage. Minimum wage can be zero. Wealth disparities don't matter. Middle class, that doesn't really matter. It's connected to virtue. And oh, by the way, if you're worth a lot, you're going to go to heaven. Disregard the part in the Bible where it says, and I'm not saying I'm Mr. Good Christian. I'm not even sure I'm a good person, okay? The only times I pray are when I'm crying. Like it's not, but I can read. I understand the religious origins of the country. I can go to the text. And the idea that worth is connected to financial worth is the essence of this movement. At least is the essence of the people who fund it. And it's not because they read the Bible. It's not because they read the New Testament. In fact, going back to our caller before, my comments before, you can only get there if you twist the Bible. You can only get there if you forget that it's harder for a rich man to make it into the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle. You can only get there if you forget Jesus turning the tables of the money changers. If you think that somehow money is connected to moral virtue, you have to forget critical parts of your Christianity rather than grapple with it. And it comes out. The Fox News pundit did not, everybody's, oh, wait, she just said it. There should be no minimum wage. It was not a slip of the tongue. That's the argument. That's the Koch brothers argument. So we don't have to, if you're talking, I just had this trip to Wyoming, extended family members I didn't know. We agreed on things that there should be a minimum wage. Majority of Americans believe there should be a minimum wage. And that it probably should be more than like $7 or $8 an hour. Americans agree on that. People who don't, you decide what to call them. Roger, you've been waiting from Sarasota. You got a few seconds here. Go ahead.
Hey, Franklin. Let me swallow this bite of lunch.
Franklin's fine.
I don't know how timely this is because I decided to call quite some time ago.
Yeah, you were very patient. You wanted to give the meaning of conservative to you. We got 1 minute.
Well, I think George Washington put it, which has become an axiom, that government which governs best governs least. That is the essence of conservatism. So when I hear people called conservative want to persecute homosexuals and outlaw abortion because it's against the Bible. Conservatism adheres to the Constitution. It espouses minimal federal government interference. And so to call people that we presently call conservative is really a bastardization of the word and the ideal.
You're absolutely right and appreciate it. Although I'll offer this one quibble. I had to look it up. You ascribe that quote to George Washington. I've heard people ascribe it to Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. Turns out it came from Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, that government is best, which governs least. And part of my other challenge is government right now, the people who are in control ain't just elected to stuff, the people who own things. And that needs to govern least.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be right back. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith.
Our book for the book report today is Taking Bullets, Terrorism and Black Life in 21st Century America, Confronting White Nationalism, Supremacy, Privilege, Plutocracy, and Oligarchy, A Poet's Representation and Challenge by Haki R. Madhuburi. He writes, this is from the chapter, page 27, the chapter Terror in the Midst of Prayer and Empire. In our perpetual state of national mourning, where our eyes are watered out and our hearts cease to heal at the rate the Creator meant them to, we hold hands in profound silence as we remember the Mother Emanuel 9 of Charleston, South Carolina, those 9 mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers. Even before burying, before black earth covered their caskets, too many ministers, media pundits, and plain white and black folks downgraded the terror that quickened their deaths of our finest in this land to the mental illness and race hatred, in quotes, of a single young white man. He may have acted alone, but he was not alone in his thinking, encouragement, gathering of arms, warped consciousness, confirmation, or ahistorical views, and yeses from the millions in the nation who proudly wear and display the Confederate flag above their hearts and fly it in all of its traitorous glory over a state capitol and other institutions. Again, we find ourselves at war with history and culture, entertaining another call for a national conversation on race and a president weary of trying to make sense of and comfort the grief-stricken nation with words from the highest office of the land. This was written while Obama was president. These are the facts, not an opinion or the ignorant ranting of compromised preachers and television pundits. A 21-year-old white man, a citizen of South Carolina, walked into the sacred and spiritual home of the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church of Charleston, the historic home of black liberation fighter Denmark Vesey, and fatally killed 9 of its members, including the pastor, during Bible study. This was a pure act of domestic terrorism. A modern-day lynching by a young white nationalist who coolly and calmly assassinated 9 black members of Mother Emanuel. Domestic violence and acts of terrorism are on the rise in the United States, as detailed by Charles Kurzman and Daniel Schanzer in their New York Times op-ed, The Other Threat, where they state that, quote, the main terrorist threat in the United States is not from violent Muslim extremists, but from right-wing extremists, end quote. In their national research, local police agencies across the country identified, quote, the militias, neo-Nazis, and sovereign citizens as the major threat the nation faces in regard to extremism, end quote. All of this is homegrown with international connections. Morris Dees and J. Richard Cohen of the Southern Poverty Law Center also writes in the New York Times article, Racists Without Borders, that, quote, Americans tend to view attacks like the mass murder in Charleston as isolated hate crimes, the work of a deranged racist or a group of zealots lashing out in anger unconnected to a broader movement. This view we can no longer afford to indulge. When, according to survivors, Mr. Roof told the victims at the prayer meeting that black people were, quote, taking over the country, he He was expressing sentiments that unite white nationalists from the United States and Canada to Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Unlike those of the civil rights era, whose main goal was to maintain Jim Crow in the American South, today's white supremacists don't see borders. They see a white tribe under attack by people of color across the globe. The end of white rule in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and South Africa, they believe, foreshadowed an apocalyptic future for all white people, a white genocide that must be stopped before it's too late. End of quote. The internationalization of terrorism is not a foreign theory in today's social media world. Dees and Cohen will be speaking at a conference in Budapest about this transnational white supremacism that is emerging as the world grows more connected technologically. The message of white genocide is spreading. Also, David J. Whitaker's Terrorism, Understanding the Global Threat, gives another view. Clearly, our rush to forgive this mass murderer within 96 hours of this supreme tragedy is misguided, anti-human, and does not allow for properly grieving the fallen. As perfectly scripted, displaying the permanent effectiveness of Christian acculturation on the Sunday, June 21st, 2015 morning services of Mother Emanuel Church, the black Christians out-Christianed their white brothers and sisters. Before the morning sermon, the presiding elder, Reverend Norvell Goff Sr., found it necessary to thank the local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies for doing their job. He also stated, quote, "A lot of folks expected us to do something strange and break out in a riot. Well, they just don't know us. We are people of faith," end quote. I find this statement inappropriate, insensitive, and ahistorical, implying, whether he meant it or not, that the recent uprising and rebellions in Ferguson, New York, Cleveland, and other parts of the nation were riots and did not include black people of faith, and that somehow they were strange in their social, political, and economic activism. Informed people do not riot against injustice or white terrorism. They study, organize, and strategically struggle at all levels, in the streets, on the campus, in front of the White House, and in corporate boardrooms. Dylan Roof stated his stated intentions were to start a race war, and informed black leadership understands that we cannot pray this away or appeal to any law enforcement agency that all across the country, including Charleston, has been seriously compromised. To label black reaction to murder, terrorism, deep unemployment, substandard housing, etc. is as right as to blame the victim. The book, Taking Bullets.
What were we just talking about? Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jefferson Smith. We've been talking about language today. One thing I promised. I want to get to Beverly's call and Nancy's call. But one thing I promised was the strategic map. And to tease it just a little bit more, introduce it a little bit more, and explain a little bit of it. I've been thinking about how we spend our time. If we are going to change the trajectory of the nation, if we are going to change from the trajectory of political power moving in a right-wing direction, certainly since 1980, some would argue since Brown versus Board of Education, moving in a regressive direction if we adopt Stella's term instead of conservative, because we've had so many callers who have pointed out the weakness of the word, the incorrectness, the inaccuracy of the word conservative as it is currently applied. That if we commit ourselves to not only being observers to what's happening in the nation, but to being activists, to being agents of change, to bending the arc of history towards justice, or the arc of the moral universe, if you prefer. What should we do? How should we focus our attention? So much of the attention of our social media feeds and of our radio and of our TV, of this program, is about the current occupant of the White House. But he did not put himself there. The condition that begat the current Congress did not happen in a year or two. It was a decades-long movement. When there was a movement to change school boards funded by the right-wing movement, using Christianity as a cover, it was a recognition that eventually you could build power, that those activists who were working on school board races could work on legislative races, and those legislative race activists could work on congressional races. And if they were doing that, of course they would vote for the president. They're not going to leave that part of the ballot blank. But what has been learned is that if you only focus the top of the ballot, sometimes people say, I came here to vote against Trump. I check that box and I can go home. I don't need to pay attention to who's running for Congress or the legislature or the U.S. Senate or county judge or city council person or dog catcher, if they elected that any further. But I assure you, if the family members of the candidate for dog catcher came to vote, they'd fill out the rest of the ballot. They'd only skip the stuff they really couldn't figure out. So what should we focus upon? And part of the challenge is if you say, hey, everybody, just focus local. What do you mean? There's a lot of local. My local's different than their local. So you end up on a national program not being able to tell anybody exactly what might be useful for them to do. That's why we welcome calls and say, hey, well, here's something we're working on that is useful. But what I did was I spent some time over the weekend at least dividing the country into a few categories. At least figuring out that, okay, I can't just say, everybody go work on your state legislative race. Oh, go work with your my state legislative race. I live in a Democratic district. The Democrat's going to win. Okay, I'll spend time for this shade of Democrat versus that shade of Democrat. Was that going to help? Well, maybe. If I say, everybody go work on campaign finance reforms, well, we can't pass that where I am. Or we already have a pretty good campaign finance system where I am. It makes it hard to generalize. And because it's hard to generalize, and people with national programs want to build their national audience, they don't want anything that only speaks to 8% of their audience or 22% of their audience or 3% of their audience. So what impacts all of you? I don't know, the Iran deal. Trump saying some racist stuff. And then, instead of working in the ways where you might have the most impact, not just sending another $3 to Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, but figuring out how you could have significant impact on the overall trajectory of democracy in the particular opportunity that's presented near you. And then we continue to spin. We continue to, win or lose a presidential race. But now you have 30 states that are fully controlled by Republican legislatures. You have a Supreme Court that is the most right-wing Supreme Court, the most regressive Supreme Court, thank you, Stella, since the Lochner era, since the turn of the last century, since the run-up to the Great Depression. And yes, I use that analogy very much on purpose, that reference. So what I did is I spent some time this weekend at least putting it in some categories. And I figured, well, if you live in a blue state, what could you do? Let's start with a blue state. If you live in a blue state, what could you do? I think if you live in a blue state, I would focus on democracy. There's other things you could do, but I would focus on democracy. I would make sure that in that state, you had a system of voting that allowed everybody to vote, that you worked on voter access. We had a caller last week that pushed this, that you push for automatic voter registration plus vote by mail with a paper record. We go big on voter access. Drape yourself, drench yourself in democracy. You could also advocate for publicly financed elections. Maybe a little harder at the state level because states have had their budgets attacked so much, but it's still doable. And if you can't get it done in this economy, you're not going to get it done in the middle of a recession. And of course, make sure your legislature is blue. Those are some blue state things to do. Now let's say you live in a blue city. Lots of you live in blue cities. What could you do? Here's where I'm going to say publicly financed elections. A 6-to-1 match like New York City or democracy vouchers like Seattle. Grow real local candidates. Remove a barrier to running. A barrier for young people, a barrier to middle-class people, a barrier to busy people, a barrier to people of color, a barrier to people without a lot of rich friends, a barrier to people who don't want to sell themselves out to corporate lobbyists. Build trust in the process. Build movements and networks that aren't dependent on corporate lobbyists. So, hey, can I get an endorsement? That person can say, oh, should I endorse that candidate Well, they're not really with my corporate lobby buddies. But if they came up in a people-based movement that wasn't funded by corporate lobbyists, then all of a sudden, yeah, I'll endorse you, and you can start building an apparatus, a pro-people apparatus. And we can do that in blue cities all across the country. That could happen in 50 cities in America. And if that happened in 50 cities in America, we would be a couple decades away from a fully transformed America. People say, oh, that's too slow. Let me tell you. Think about how long it's going to take to change the Supreme Court. There will be real world impact of doing that. You'll have impact on an immediate term. You'll have impact on housing. Stuff in my city just happened with more people-based candidates. They've been working hard on access to housing. You'll have real impacts in real lives in blue cities if you have people-based movements. But it will also have big long-term benefit, both short-term and long-term benefit. But what happens? What happens if you work, if you live, if you activate, if you engage in a purple state? What do I do then? I can't do all this fluffy-hearted stuff you're talking about, Jeff. I live in Michigan. I live in Pennsylvania. I live in Wisconsin. I live in a place where, well, there are things for you too. Win your legislature. Adopt a legislative district. Figure out where the close legislative districts are and volunteer for that person, donate to that person, build minor movements to help that person. That's how we got the bus project started. Bus project's now changing its name. Now it's the Alliance for Youth Action something or other, has headquarters in 11 states, but has started out recognizing that young people could have a significant impact on local legislative races. So can you. Another thing you can do, like Michigan did, nonpartisan redistricting. Nonpartisan redistricting to say, and if you do this, if this happens only in blue states and doesn't happen in red states, well, all that'll happen is that you'll end up sending more Republicans to Congress. But Eric Holder's work to try to purify a little bit the districting process is noble work. And in purple states, in states where aptly drawn districts will create aptly drawn, will send representatives. That is both moral and strategic. You can also, in those states, work on the national popular vote. It might give it a chance. It's winning in the blue states. If you can get national popular vote done in a purple state, well, then we're going to have a popular vote in the country if that happens in the purple states. Win the legislature, nonpartisan redistricting, and national popular vote. That's the purple state map. We got 1 minute left, but don't worry. But Jeff, I live in a red state. I live in Alabama. I live in North Carolina. Well, you're kind of a swing state now. But I live in South Carolina. I live in Ohio, which is not nearly as much of a blue state as it used to be, not even much as a purple state. Well, Ohio, I'm going to still say go yourself in the purple direction. Look at your legislature. Look at your nonpartisan redistricting. But if you're in just a really red state, nonpartisan gerrymandering if you can, but also you live in a purple city, change the party structure. Advocate for a different way to elect folks. Because I recognize in some places in this country, it's just a really long way to remind, hey, wait a minute, Democrats used to win here. You know, I know you've been listening to Limbaugh and watching Fox News for a long time and some right-wing Christian preacher who somehow pretends that God is for big military and big business because they didn't read the New Testament. Might be a bridge too far to say vote Democrat. But it might not be a bridge too far to say, hey, let's have a system that's not quite so partisan. Let's have a system that allows for other parties to have voices. And then somebody can run under independent or run under Working Families Party, and they can still be pro-democracy. They don't have to be a Democrat, but they can be pro-democracy. They can be pro-human. They can be pro-climate. They can be pro-middle class. That's my quick map. I'm Jefferson Smith. This is Tom's show. Thanks for listening.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be right back, 202-808-9925. Beverly, you win Most Patient Listener Award. You are on from Austin, Texas. Speak your piece.
Okay. Thank you for taking my call. How does what Trump wants America to be differ from apartheid?
I find myself wanting to answer your question two ways. One, to say both, it's basically to compare and contrast. How it's similar is he is creating an ideology, and wants to create a regulatory structure that does benefit folks or punish folks based more on race. Where it's different is that, and I think I want to be careful not to overstate, is I have not yet seen any proposal that says, if you are a blank color, you don't get blank. So far, it's only been, if you're a Muslim from another country, then you don't get to come here. If you are coming from south of the border, you're not allowed to come here unless you can dig under a wall. So I would say that that's my very quick compare and contrast. But what about you, Beverly? What is your compare and contrast? Beverly, you there? You're not allowed to come here unless you can. Oh, all right, Beverly. Well, thanks for calling. Let's go to Nancy, who has also been waiting very patiently from Elkhart, Indiana. Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. But yeah, I've been reading and listening to yours, so I like to pick up on things that the other callers have said.
Me too.
One of the things that I do like when you had said about the words that are so important, and that goes along, I think, with your making your area listen to what you're saying. I used to be, back in the 60s, when everything was so violent, one of our professors in college, when we were being educated to be educators, they were saying that nothing can change in our country until we all realize how racist almost every one of us is.
Yeah.
And this idea that you could check yourself, one of the things that we found ourselves, and I think you mentioned doing it, is every time you want to tell a story about something, if you want to mention that the thing that happened was terrible, like if you want to say, oh, there was a robbery down there at the local filling station, if you wanted to indicate that it was done by a bad person, you would say, oh my gosh, this black person pulled up to the station and pulled out a gun. And if you just wanted to say that it was a normal person, you certainly wouldn't say, oh, there was this white person that pulled up to the gas station.
By normal, you mean white.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Exactly.
You would say, to indicate to your friends
Yep.
that it was a, quote, normal person.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say the word white. That's
Yep.
because you knew, in your mind, you'd been trained that
Yep.
was to be a racist person.
Yep.
And this happens a lot. And we have to remind ourselves that things that we think are normal, that means white. Just like you said with the White House and things like that. And our educators, they were telling us this, that we all have this incessant racism.
Nancy, I agree with you fully. Of the many instances of my own shame in my life, one of my quiet shames was when I was describing the difference between, I think I've told this story before, so forgive that, but I was telling the story about it. Wesley Snipes was playing a character in a movie. It was Rising Sun, I think, a book I'd read. And I told somebody, well, in the book, it was just a normal guy. It wasn't a black guy. And I said that, not catching my own racism. All of us need to work on ourselves, our own violence, our own toxicity. Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. It's about time for the big finish. Let's do a quick speed round because people have been waiting so patiently, including Tim from Milwaukee. Go ahead, Tim.
Hey, Jeff. Language is important, but we need pragmatic or practical steps. Obviously, we all want to see Trump gone, or most of us do. Mitch McConnell's got to be next in the shoe. He has to go. He's the biggest impediment to actual democracy, and he's stacking the courts. So anybody in Kentucky, or even if you're outside, just vote or put your efforts towards. It's a woman, and I'm drawing a blank on her name, but we got to get rid of him. But yeah, and language is important. The only other thing I would say is courage is the big word for me. Have the courage to talk to people who are on the right, and my family is part of that. And so every word you use matters, but if you don't have the courage to start the conversation, you won't be able to use the other words.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tim. Amy McGrath, I think, is the candidate that you were looking for. Amy McGrath is running. I think that is one path to beat McConnell. The other way is to elect sufficient Democrats that he no longer gets to be the head of the Senate. So if you live in Maine, you got another one. Tomorrow I'll probably go through the Senate races. Let's be honest about speed round. Mary, free speech versus conservative parents from Fort Worth, Texas.
Yes, I'll describe just the local situation quickly to you. An outstanding art teacher working with elementary school children, first, second, and third grade children, had been teaching successfully for 10 years without any incident, but suddenly decided to show a video of herself and her girlfriend and tell these children in the first, second, and third grade that they were going to get married. At the next school board meeting, there was predictable parental protest, and the teacher was put on paid suspended leave, and later on in the school year reassigned to a high school. Now, this teacher has sued to get her elementary school back and to have no restrictions on her speech, because she said if she had announced she was going to marry a man, there would have been no incident, and that's probably true. My question would be, is whose free speech should prevail here? The teacher in the classroom or the tax-paying parents? Should they have some control over the instructional program?
Yeah, well, I'd say you asked the question about free speech. We're not talking about the free speech of parents. It is not free speech to fire somebody who has a same-sex partner, is what I heard you say. That's a different matter than just speech. But a lot of this is what militated the culture wars in the United States of America. And my hope is that we can bend the arc of history towards justice, which includes making sure that we let people know that they belong, that they have humanity and dignity also, while making sure that we don't get so mired merely in that debate, while we make sure that debate is part of a movement for overall addressing to save the minimum wage, to save the middle class, to save democracy, and save the climate. We only got another minute or so. Joe, got to be fast from Indianapolis.
Yeah, you were talking about how you want to fix the voting in the country. Just a couple comments. One, putting judges in charge of redistricting is not going to make it nonpartisan. In fact, it's just going to drag the judiciary into politics.
Nobody. I didn't say judges.
Well, who's going to do it then?
I think you do a nonpartisan redistricting commission. That's not what I'm saying, but that's what the organization that's working on this. That's what Holder's saying, and that's what Michigan just did. Is you still have a human being body. There's a lot of ways to structure it, but one way is just do 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and two nonpartisan folks, and they fight over it to try to draw good lines. Kyle from Chicago, go ahead.
Yeah, I was calling when you were talking about minimum wage and Republicans' viewpoint, which, I mean, you misrepresent. And I guess the quick point is, you at least have to get honest that conservatives aren't coming up with their viewpoint to hold people back or because they hate people or human worth or any of these things. It's their honest opinion on what provides the most people the best path forward, not to hold people back. Yeah, no,
I think that it is. I think there's 2 parts. I would say there's from my impression, there's 2 parts. And I don't think just about any person who voted for Donald Trump goes to bed and says, "Oh, I want to vote for Donald Trump because I want to hold people back." That's not human beings as I understand them. I do think the militating force in the movement that has built the propaganda, that funded public choice theory, that built the Virginia school, that built the Chicago school, that the rhetorical apparatus that is fueled and been fueled by the right-wing propaganda apparatus on radio and on television is making a deeply flawed argument, which is reward the powerful at the expense of the powerless, and everything else is just going to work out. And that is, I will acknowledge, to me, the big lie of the 20th century. I don't believe for most people who vote that way, it's because of bad motives. They agree with that viewpoint that if you cut taxes for the highest income earners, or more importantly, perhaps the highest wealth holders, that's somehow going to benefit everybody. I understand that's an honestly held view. I just think that view has been empirically shown to be wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that means we shift to some other ridiculous extreme where nobody can earn anything based on how hard they work or how smart they are. Nobody makes that argument either. But we have shifted so far from the Eisenhower era And we are seeing the fruits of it, which includes, and I think I'm going to have to finish with this, which includes gaping wealth disparities in the country, that includes what we're seeing with the evisceration of our planet. I don't think anybody who voted for Donald Trump or voted for the Bushes or voted for Ronald Reagan says, oh, I want to vote for these guys so we can make sure that we have more forest fires. I don't think anybody thought that. She's like, oh, well, regulation's a hassle. We don't want to mess with that hassle. Well, it turns out now we're having more forest fires. I believe and agree that for so many, the viewpoints are honestly held. At the same time, I think that some of those are deeply, deeply flawed. And I also think have been flawed on purpose by people whose motives were cynical, whose motives weren't Christian, whose motives weren't even capitalist in the best sense. I'm going to be back tomorrow, tell you more things that I think that I might be wrong, and more importantly, harvest the really good thinking that many of the listeners have been offering and appreciate it. Kyle, do appreciate your call. Sounded like you think there should be a minimum wage. That is something we agree upon. I'll be back tomorrow. I'm Jefferson Smith, and you are priceless. Definition of priceless, worth a lot, not for sale. Thanks, everybody, and thank you, democracy.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.